Let's see. Close the window. Shut the map before. I'll just check now if that's it live on YouTube. That's a bit of a delay, so if yep, so that's verified to be live. Yeah, so good evening, people, or good morning or good afternoon, whenever you're watching this. This this will be the last stream I'm doing the American Civil War for a while. So as mentioned before, I'm planning on doing a stream about the Battle of Gettysburg on July the 3rd. But between now and then, I haven't really got any plans other than next week. I'm going to do a stream about about the Reconquista. I've got get. I will be having Mercy and Tharium, Iron Duke, and Beta Britannia, as well as possibly AI Shaitori, depending on. I still need to get in touch. I imagine he'll be available. It'll either be next Thursday or Friday. So, if people wonder what is happening to the American Civil War series, I'll be putting on a hold for a few months, just so I don't get burnt out from it, because I've been doing this because it's worth noting. It's just been over 2 months since that first Stonewall Jackson stream. So, been going the past 2 months, and yeah, I'm going to take a break from Civil War. I will come back to it later on in the year, where I aim to do guys like Jefferson Davis, John C. Breckinridge. I'll do a stream about Reconstruction or two, although that's going to take a lot of time, because finding good history books about that period of American history is a bit of a weird one, obviously, as anyone can easily fathom. So yeah, this stream is about Patrick R. Cleburne, who I've been reading Shelby Foote's trilogy. I'm only 150 odd pages off from finishing off the first volume, and I've also been listening to his interviews, and I do concur with Shelby Foote that Patrick R. Cleburne is probably the best divisional commander either side of the Civil War produced. In much the same way that I would consider Nathan Bedford Forrest the best cavalry guy of the American Civil War, I would say Patrick R. Cleburne is the best divisional commander. In much the same way that I probably would say there's a lot of debate, but at the moment I'm still sticking to the idea that I'm still sticking to my opinion that Stonewall Jackson probably has to be one of the most brilliant generals of the Civil War. Now, people might take umbrage with that, with, oh, well, he wasn't brilliant, because, compared, you look at the casualties and all this, I would say brilliant in retrospect to the period he lived, in much the same way that, we look upon, let's say, someone like Napoleon as being one of the most brilliant generals of history, or Hannibal as being brilliant for the time they lived in, whereas, you can imagine if Napoleon tried to command armies now, he'd struggle because different times and so on. Yeah, so it's just that's just the way the cookie crumbles with time. Yeah, so without further ado, I'll share screen and I'll leave some time for people to filter in after that introduction. This is a song by a guy called Derek Warfield as a tribute to Patrick R. Cleburne. So without further ado.
Far and fast as the autumn blast beats dead leaves o'er the ground. How fast and far is the hand of war through countries brave around. Their nameless graves on ocean's caves, in forest and mountain and glen, where the vulture screams and the angry streams are hiding the bones of men. And what anguish cries from the south arise for the brave ones fallen in vain, while the victor north blows trumpets forth and exalts in our broad domain. And they'll tell with pride how Cleburne died in the land of the free and the brave, and his sword of might was a beam of light, though it led to an exile's grave. Then fling on the horde their base award, their chief is triumphal crown. Place vile deceit in his judgment seat, where honour is trampled down. Give a paltry bribe to a hired scribe, to a venal bard his fee, and to him who draws on a righteous cause, a freeman's sword give me. Though his bones should bleach on a sea-washed beach, there was grave be a lonely mound. His name shall chime through the halls of time, and swell through the deep profound. And they'll tell with pride how Cleburne died in the land of the free and the brave. How his sword of might was a beam of light, though it led to an exile's grave. Richmond's plain, his captive train outnumber the host he led, and he won his stars on the field of Mars, where glorious Johnson bled. Was his big hope, while a ray of hope illumined his flag, and then was his to die when his flag flew high in his band with the stalwart men. For no braver host could e'er and boast, nor he a more gallant knight, since the peerless few crossed the avenue, cast Bagnall's host to flight. And they'll tell with pride how Cleburne died in the land of the free and the brave. How his sword of might was a beam of light, though it led to an exile's grave. There were eyes afar who watched your star as it rose with the Southern Cross. There were hearts that bled when your course was sped, and old Ireland fell to your loss. While the flowers shall blow and waters flow to the Shannon, the Shore and the Lee, and the patriot song shall roll along, and winding the waves for thee. So the deepest wave of the fallen brave, where Cleburne crossed the lines, and the rank and fire from our own fair isle showed courage in foreign pines. And they'll tell with pride how Cleburne died in the land of the free and the brave. And the sword of might was a beam of light, though it led to an exile's grave.
Yeah, so that was a song for which I can't find the lyrics anywhere, but some of the lyrics I can recollect to for later reference. So, for example, where it says "Exile's grave," that's a reference to how after the Battle of Franklin, for example, Cleburne's corpse was put into this sort of pauper's grave, and it was mixed in with like former slave soldiers, Yankees, and a lot of just dead Confederate soldiers, which they didn't have the time to fully identify. So it was just a mask. So he was in a sort of solitary grave almost, because they could tell he was an officer. And after he dies, of course, there's with the addition of that burial place just after Franklin, there were like another two burial places. Cleburne's body was put. One was at a church in Georgia, which was also called St. Mary's, because, as I'll go into shortly, Cleburne was baptized at a church named after St. Mary over in County Cork when he was born in 1828. And then you have, finally, he was buried where I forget, Crowley Ridge meets along the Mississippi in eastern Arkansas, nearby Helena, where Cleburne set up, like where Cleburne lived before the Civil War broke out. And I'll go through sort of his early life shortly now. I'll share a screen. So here at Bright Park Cottage, which it would look like this. This photo was taken many years after his birth, for obvious reasons, but this is what Bright Park Cottage looked like. So that's where he was born, then with a bride. visit came to Cork. Up the river, you've got St Mary's Church, which is a Protestant church, because it's worth noting, of course, while Cleburne was an Irishman, he was not an Irish Catholic, and what's more, he was very much of that sort of minor gentry background. Like his family wasn't exactly swimming in wealth, but they owned land and they had sort of that aristocratic pedigree to them, however small it was. So they're of that Protestant ascendancy class, and this is why Cleburne, his hero throughout his life, like sort of the personal hero he had throughout his entire life was the Duke of Wellington, whom he liked to study, especially in history class, and so this is where he's baptised. Over here at Greenfield School, that's where he went to school. You also got a military barracks around here, Balin Colleague, which he later joins up with the 41st Regiment of Foot when he becomes a young man. Here at Grange House, so this is what Grange House would look like. That's what we don't have a photograph of it, I don't think, but that's what the house looked like by sketch, and that's where, and you can see it's not a really grandiose property, because it's worth noting, because that, as a minor gentry family, they weren't swimming in wealth, to say the least. They had some land and they were able to do all right by aristocratic standards. However, when you get the potato famine in 1846, the family fortunes really sink. Like they can't get, they rely upon getting rents from their Irish Catholic tenants, but the potato crop failing means that a lot of these Irish Catholic tenants they have, either they're dying of starvation or they're moving over to America to seek better fortune, for example. So it's a matter of, so while Patrick did indeed have a great deal of deference dealt to him by the tenants on the land, by the time he's into early adulthood, his family's fortune in Ireland, what they have of it anyway, is broken by the potato famine. And it's in the 1840s that Cleburne makes a decision to join, because it's worth noting, as a young man in his teens, he was apprenticed to a pharmacy not far from his home. However, in the midst of a potato famine, of course, that pharmacy he works at, it doesn't afford great opportunities. So he makes an effort to try and study over at Trinity College in Dublin. However, he's rejected because one thing his apprenticeship did not teach him was Latin. Which, had he known Latin, he would have been accepted by Trinity College, but alas, it was not meant to be. And dealt with that rejection, Cleburne then made the decision to join the army, and that's where for 41st Regiment of Foot, this is one of their barracks, that's where he joins up, and you have a dual field nearby. Cork, of course, being 6 miles away, and that's how Cleburne joins the army. He serves in the army for a fair few years. He was hoping to serve abroad, however, he was kept in Ireland around the time of the potato famine, and his experiences seeing all these paupered Irish Catholic tenants of his starving to death, this is what makes him, eventually he moves to leave the army at a later point, and he alongside his family make the decision that they're going to go over to America because they can't make any money in Ireland, so they make the decision to emigrate to America for greener shores. Now, when they do get over to America, the family splits up. So, for example, you have Pat Cleburne, who ends up in Helena, Arkansas. Meanwhile, another branch of his family end up in Ohio, I think Cincinnati area, if I remember correctly, not far from Ohio River. Because, of course, one thing you notice about the family is that they all move not far from either the Mississippi or the tributaries of the Mississippi. So Ohio River, or I believe Cleburne also had a younger brother by name Christopher or Kit, who moved over to Kentucky, and he later served in the Confederate Army, not under Cleburne's command, but But Kit serves under the Confederate cavalry of John Hunt Morgan, and he unfortunately gets killed in the Civil War. So that's a bit of a down on that. So that's a short rundown of Cleburne's history prior to emigrating. So this is what Helena, Arkansas kind of looks like. I mean, ignore the sunken ship here. Like this is a drawing from during the Civil War. I couldn't find one of Helena, Arkansas before the Civil War. So yeah, and he gets accepted for a job by Charles Nash, who has a pharmacy in Helena, Arkansas. And by all rights, Cleburne does really well for himself over the next few years. So so of course, this is 1854. He's in America and in Helena, Arkansas, and he's a very quiet guy, very much what you might call a silent workhorse. And yeah, despite the fact that he doesn't know Latin, that's no impediment to him getting employment as a pharmacist in context of America, because Arkansas, of course, while it has been a part of America since the Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson, Arkansas is most like a frontier. It's the same with Ohio, like where U.S. Grant and Sherman come from, but it was still relatively like frontierish. It was only really the Eastern Seaboard that was fully developed. So out in the West, there was a lot more opportunity for someone like Cleburne, who, as a guy who's been apprenticed and has served in the army, he's got opportunities here for him. And later on, I believe around 1856, 57, you have an election where you have, so around this time, the Whig Party, which is kind of like what the proto-Republican Party, because it's worth noting the Democrat Party goes back to Andrew Jackson in 1828. The Whigs, they fell apart because Stephen A. Douglas, who was Lincoln's rival in Illinois, brought about what we call the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively meant that the newly made state of Kansas and Nebraska, which were previously territories, of course, they get proper sovereignty applied to them regarding whether they want to have slavery or not. The problem with that is it issues in bleeding Kansas, and you have like a miniature civil war go on where you especially got guys like John Brown start to feature in, and this destroys the Whig Party. And for a brief while, you have the Know Nothing Party, which is kind of like trying to think of Daniel Day-Lewis's character from that film set in New York. But basically, that kind of party where it was very much a nativist, nationalist party. You know, the whole point was sticking up for American Protestants against Irish, Italian, and as well as other, especially German immigration, because a lot of 48ers come moving in, and a lot of native-born Americans were very much against that. Here, there's a photo of Thomas C. Hindman, who later becomes a Confederate general, and what's more, so Hindman was a Whig originally. However, he joins up with the Southern Democrats because the Know Nothing Party, they were more northern rather than southern. So the Southern Democrats taking a lot of people who were formerly Whigs, including some Thomas C. Hindman, and he strikes up a friendship with Cleburne. Now, Thomas C. Hindman being a Whig, of course, he's got a massive philia for Napoleon, whereas Cleburne, as previously mentioned, he's far more of a, I suppose you could say, it's Tory-ish kind of persuasion, especially regarding the Duke of Wellington. So while they might disagree on, for example, history and issues of that sort, they do strike up a good friendship. For one time in 1857, Hindman and Cleburne were in the middle of a duel, like in the middle of a gunfight with a bunch of Know Nothing Party supporters in Arkansas. And while Cleburne did get shot in the back, I believe, alongside Hindman, they both survived, and they in turn gunned down one of the guys who tried to gun them down, and the second guy who tried to gun down Cleburne and his friend Hindman, he was forced to relinquish his sidearm. So already, you can, and that's a sort of a miniature episode where you can see Cleburne's sort of signature calm under fire and in sort of initiative in that he stays calm. Stays cool, calm, and collected, and he doesn't waver in the midst of a gunfight. So, yeah, that's sort of a brief thing. Now, people know of if I can find Yeah, so people know of this particular photograph of Patrick R. Cleburne with a sort of beard he's got. Uh, Whereas before the Civil War, he was clean shaven. Uh, so this is what he would have looked like before the Civil War broke out. The only reason he had a beard was because a bullet tore through his cheek at a battle in the Civil War, Battle of Richmond, which I'll go into later, where it tears through his cheek, takes out two of his teeth, and to cover up the scar, he grows a beard. So that's what happens with his later facial hair. So in 1861, you get all the secession. Tennessee is one of the last states to secede from the Union because it's worth noting about Tennessee. So, for example, as mentioned before with Nathan Birdwood Forrest, most Tennesseans are descended from people who originally came from South Carolina. So, when Lincoln calls for volunteers to invade South Carolina as well as Confederate states such as Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, you eventually get states like Tennessee. You also got Arkansas is one of the latest states to join as well. They join, because it's worth noting the South is kind of like one big family, where South Carolina, especially the Carolinas and Virginians, a lot of people from that neck of the woods have familial relations with people further west. So, for example, Texas was settled by people who came from Tennessee, who in turn came from people from South Carolina. So that so that's the sort of nuanced perspective you can get about why secession happened the way it did in 1861. Why, even though Fort Sumter was one of those things where Lincoln maneuvered things so that he would look like the offended party and not the Confederates looking like the victim, it was still a situation where the idea of sending troops down south offended everyone in the upper south, which is why you get Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas seceding. And upon the secession, initially Cleburne becomes a regimental commander. However, before long, he ends up becoming a brigade commander because they note that he's got really good leadership qualities, and it's worth noting that regimental commanders were elected, whereas brigadier generals, major generals, and then lieutenant generals and so on, those are appointed. But Cleburne, so to get into the Civil War, so from Helena, nearby the Mississippi River in eastern Arkansas, they go up to a place called Fort Rector, nearby Memphis. At this time, around this time in late 1861, he gets put in charge of a brigade. He gets promoted because there was an episode here where I think it was Leonardus Polk. He threatened that there was a Union force coming in around here, doing a reconnaissance force of Western Tennessee. It turned out to be a false alarm. However, the way that Cleburne handled his men was such that he ended up getting promoted to brigadier general, and he serves under William G. Hardy, who, this being William J. Does it William J. Hardy or William J. Hardy? I don't know what to say. William G. Hardy. William J. Hardy, who I don't know too much about, but I will say, from what I've read about him thus far, he seems a fairly. I mean, it's worth noting he wrote the infantry tactics book that both sides implemented in the Civil War. So, in much the same way that Henry Dundas, I think it was, wrote the British Army's Art of War in the 1780s for the Napoleonic Wars, William J. Hardy did the same for the Confederate Army, especially in the Civil War. So you do have here at Fort Rector, they set up for a while, training the troops. Cleburne, he easily becomes recognised. So one thing he does is that he's not like Braxton Bragg, who punishes people very viciously. What he would do is if anyone offends, so for example, if you're found looting or doing anything untoward, you don't get anything like flogging, for example. What instead you get is you're forced to carry a guardrail for a mile. In so doing, it's kind of like it's a punishment, but also it's a sort of softer punishment that doesn't go overboard. Unlike what Braxton Bragg would do in his campaigns, where he'll have a guy from Kentucky executed because the guy apparently deserted, even though he served long of his enlistment and only went home because Kentucky was facing a drought at the time. And so Cleburne, he instantly wins a little bit of his men, even though he's very quiet by personality. For example, before the war, it was reckoned that Cleburne he could never speak to a woman. Like he was just what we in modern day parlance might call a sensitive young man. So very shy towards women. Like for example, it was only in the Civil War in his mid-30s that he was actually able to find a woman to get engaged to, but that doesn't end well, as I will detail later on in the stream. So you have him. So you have Cleburne training up troops in Western Tennessee. Later, they go down the river. So, for example, it's worth noting that Cleburne's first regiment is it commands. It's called the First Arkansas. However, they're forced to change their name to the Fifth because another regiment claimed the honor of being the first, which Cleburne really didn't like for obvious reasons. But it was forced upon him anyway by, I think, the governor of Arkansas, at least someone much higher than him in the pecking order. So he just had to make do with that. And so they go down. So they go down the Mississippi, and then they go up towards Greenville, Missouri. The Missouri, nothing really much happens in Missouri. So nothing much of consequence in the context of a Western theater, other than you do get a battle at Belmont, which is around here across the river from Columbus, where of course the U.S. Grant fought off a force under Gideon Pillow, and then later on Leonard's Polk. So so after stopping for a while in Greenville, where before there was a Union force at Ironton, and Missouri was largely lost because of bungling on the Confederate side. So they go back down south, and then back south into Arkansas, and then go eastward to New Madrid, and then they go on down. And this is where William J. Hardee's troops, they go all the way past northern Tennessee into Kentucky, past Bowling Green, and then they journey down the railway past Nashville in time for Battle of Shiloh. They meet up so Albert Sidney Johnston and Peter T. Beauregard, they're marshalling up an army at Corinth because Fort Henry of Donelson had fallen. Nashville had to fall soon thereafter. And this is February 1862. So early April 1862, you then get the Battle of Shiloh, which, there's a reason why Shelby Foote wrote his own sort of novel about that battle, because it's the first great battle of the war, and it was really a massive bloodletting. Like, for example, the combined casualties from Shiloh were 25,000, and when you factor all the major American wars up to that point, so Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Mexican War of 1848, those three wars together, their casualties were less than the total casualties from both sides at Shiloh. So you easily understand why Shiloh was such a massive shock to the system for the vast majority of Americans on the southern side and the northern side, although not for the likes of Sherman, who forewarned for ages in advance that so Sherman and Jackson were probably the two people least surprised by how bloody Shiloh turned out to be. But nevertheless, it's a shock to the system. And so Cleburne, he serves under he serves on the left flank. One of his skirmishers actually fires a bullet into Sherman's left hand, and that's how Sherman gets his wound at the Battle of Shiloh. Cleburne skirmishers. It's worth noting, you see here, this is really, I forget his undergrowth, it was sort of like a marshland. So Cleburne was forced to split his command in two. So his brigade were cut into two, and he couldn't practice proper command and control over his brigade because only a regiment and a half here where Cleburne is, and it's only like later on, towards the end of the day, that he's able to get his brigade all back together. But by that point, his brigade suffered heavy casualties, and by the time he comes to nightfall, this is where Cleburne is. However, you do get federal reinforcements coming in through Pittsburgh Landing, and you get the counterattack. During the first day of the battle, Cleburne, he's commanded by Braxton Bragg, who's not even his direct commander. It was William J. Hardy on the left flank, but Braxton Bragg is worth noting, as Shelby Foote would say, and it was such a chaotic battle that it was like 100 small skirmishes going off at the same time. The map here doesn't really show it, but Shiloh, you could go from one end of a battlefield. You can go from Owl Creek here to Lick Creek and not come across a single ray of sunlight because it was so thickly wooded. You get some clearings here, like for farming, but it was just so thickly forested that you could go from one end of a battlefield to another without seeing sunlight. And it's very much like imagine fighting a line Napoleonic style battle in the middle of Mirkwood from a Hobbit. That's kind of what it was like to fight at Shiloh. So that's how. So people might say, well, Cleburne didn't properly exercise command and control. That was just what Clausewitz would call friction. Friction being that what happens is you might have a plan on paper, but in reality, you might have stuff like terrain or the condition of the troops or let's say the weather or other factors, let's say beyond the controls embedded within the planning, that just affect how the battle goes. It's as the old saying goes, a battle plan does not survive contact with the enemy. And Shiloh was very much that for the Confederates. And the terrible misfortune for the Confederates was they were slowed down by rain. Because it says 6th of April where it started, and had they started the day before on the 5th, they would have won because it was only by the graces of God that Grant was reinforced by Buell when he was. Had Buell not been in to reinforce him, it's reckoned that Grant would have been defeated and he would have been sacked soon thereafter, and the war would have probably gone a different direction in the West because Halleck, who was U.S. Grant's superior, of course, as detailed 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago, very much not equal to the job. But as we know, the Union wins Shiloh almost by the skin of their teeth. And yeah, Cleburne, his command suffers something like 40 to 50% casualties. For reference, in NATO, if you suffer 10% casualties, you're deemed combat ineffective. And yet, many of his units, not least Cleburne's men, who proved to be some of the bravest, but also worstly commanded in terms of Braxton Bragg, ordered them to attack the Hornet's Nest. Because you see Hornet's Nest here, and it's called Hornet's Nest for a reason, because it was just hell on earth. You have Prentice's troops. I don't know why it says Hornet's Nest here. It should be here where Prentice's troops are. Prentice's troops may incur heavy casualties upon the Confederates, but never. And Cleburne loses a lot of men, being stupidly commanded by Bragg to attack it frontally instead of outflanking or whatever. But nevertheless, Hornet's Nest falls at great loss to both sides, and this is where you get positions on nightfall. Yeah, and then of course you get the counterattack the day after, where U.S. Grant and Buell, just as well as Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace, of course, being the guy who famously wrote Ben-Hur while he was ambassador to the Turks, I believe, not long after I don't know. Lew Wallace was the ambassador of America to the Ottoman Empire after James Longstreet in 1881. So yeah, that's a bit of a little factoid I found interesting. And as you can see, you got Cleburne, who's kind of on the left flank of Hardy, who's also on the left flank. And you got clearance here, you got but yeah, it is. Were it not for the fact that Grant was reinforced by Buell, the Confederates would have won the battle. But also, it boils down to even if the Confederates had won, there'd be suffering like such grievous casualties in this battle. It's kind of like, well, what does victory look like? Yeah, and I would say to people interested in this, I'd say read Shelby Foote's novel of Shiloh, which really, because he has like a number of POV characters that kind of sell to how just much of a mess it all was. Like if anyone's ever played a Total War game trying to attack a wooded hill, but where your enemy's entrenched and dug in, that's kind of what Shiloh was like. It's just hellish, to say the least. So yeah, after Shiloh, the Confederates go back to Corinth, and when you get into October time, because it's worth noting that not October, I'm trying to think when it was now. July or August, like it was, I think it was July from memory serves, because basically Halleck dragged his feet around pursuing the attack after Shiloh, because U.S. Grant was proposing that they take Corinth straight after Shiloh, but Henry Halleck was too cautious for his own good. And yeah, so he didn't pursue. Corinth gets taken later on, mainly because what happened was, so on the right flank, PGT Beauregard had tried to have Earl Van Dorn attack the Union troops and tried to envelop their left flank. However, Earl Van Dorn got lost in a swamp. So the battle goes really badly, and PGT Beauregard, he sees no avenue of success. So in other words, that's where he agrees to give up Corinth. Because it's worth noting, of course, Albert Sidney Johnston, who was in charge of the Confederate Army, he got killed at Shiloh, and PGT Beauregard takes over the Army of. It was called the Army of the Mississippi, but later it gets changed to Army of Tennessee. And yeah, PGT Beauregard is forced to abandon Corinth. After that, he's sacked by Jefferson Davis, and he's replaced by Braxton Bragg, who, as previously mentioned, so Braxton Bragg, one of the most hated commanders on the Confederate side, without question. Like, for example, back in the Mexican War, his own men tried to kill him with an artillery shell underneath his bed. Unfortunately, he didn't get killed by it. The bed got blown up, but he wasn't there. So yeah, I've heard, like, I mean, I don't know how deforested the Eastern Seaboard is, because now it's like my map of Eastern Seaboard thick forest is, I'm thinking of like New England, and also I'm thinking of Last of Mohicans, like sort of that era of American history by James Fenimore Cooper, and that kind of history of America when I think of that sort of thick forest. Yeah. So Braxton Bragg, as mentioned, yeah, he was one of those hated commanders that the Confederates had on their side. And yeah, it goes to say, yeah. So Braxton Bragg, as you get into August, what happens is there's what's called the Heartland Offensive. It's called the Heartland Offensive because there's a lot of Confederate supporters, especially Eastern Kentucky. So you're talking, I think Frankfurt or Frankfurt, however you pronounce it. I've heard people pronounce it Frankfurt, so I'm going to pronounce it that way because it sounds like a German city. Yeah, so this area of Kentucky, there's a lot of Confederate supporters, whereas Western Kentucky, there were some, but after Leonidas Polk breached Kentucky neutrality, a lot of support around here is just dead for the Confederates, especially around Bowling Green and Cairo, Paducah, Columbus way. So Eastern Kentucky is where it's more concentrated. And the thing about it was, you have, so here at Chattanooga, you got Braxton Bragg. He sets out from Chattanooga on August 28th. Now you see here August 14th from Knoxville set out. Kirby Smith, Cleburne serves under him because Kirby Smith, he later gets put in charge of the Trans-Mississippi Department. And I will say, Kirby Smith was a capable general in his own right. However, he was too much of a glory hunter, and this is the first failing of the Heartland Offensive from the get-go, was that they had a 2-week barrier, like they had a 2-week gap between. So they should have set off at the same time, personally, because Bragg was going to go up through Mumfordville, and then Kirby Smith would go through Richmond and Lexington to Louisville. So Bragg and Kirby Smith, they were meant to meet at Louisville, where hopefully they would battle against Buell, because the two main options that Bragg had really were he could go against U.S. Grant in Western Tennessee, around Memphis area, but of course they were too well fortified, especially around Memphis area. So Bragg decides he's going to go for Buell, and I got to be honest, like that was actually a good decision on Bragg's part, because Buell was too lethargic a commander. Like he really wasn't a good commander at all. And as after this offensive, for example, the way he handles the Union side of things, he gets sacked, and I don't think he holds a command again after that. I don't believe, or at least you don't hear anything major of him after this campaign. So you have Kirby Smith. He advances from eastern Kentucky. Here on August 30th, there's a Battle of Richmond. Now, Battle of Richmond probably has to be the most lopsided victory of a war, because you have something like 6,000 Confederates against 6,000 Union, give or take. I'm not. There's a bit of a controversy. Like I don't trust Wikipedia about numbers, and I don't believe, and he didn't give me the numbers in the book I was reading about Pat Cleburne. But anyway, so peer-to-peer forces at Richmond. Kirby Smith, with the help of Cleburne and other capable subordinates, they completely surround and obliterate this Union force, so that the Union force under Kirby Smith, they only suffered something like 462 casualties. Meanwhile, the Union forces, they suffered something like 4,300 taken captive and another 700 casualties. So that's well over 10-1 casualties for a start between the Union and the Confederates. So I think that has to be the most lopsided victory either side produced in a Civil War by far. And the victory at Richmond has to go in large part to Pat Cleburne, because he was able to pin down the Union forces while Kirby Smith got his left and right flank to do a double envelopment and completely obliterate the Union forces under William Bull Nelson. Funny thing about William Bull Nelson was he treats over to Louisville with only his staff, because the rest of his men got taken captive or just obliterated altogether. At Louisville, he gets into a feud with a certain Jefferson C. Davis, not the Confederate president, of course, but a Union general who happened to be called that, who I mentioned on William T. Sherman's stream about the March to the Sea. Jefferson C. Davis actually shot and got dead over this feud, because and there was a lot of controversy. I mean, because of course, normally you'd get done for murder. However, Halleck decided that in the end he could not afford to spare Jefferson C. Davis at this time. So in other words, a Union general got away with murdering another Union general because of how desperate the situation in Kentucky was. And I would say, like, and U.S. Grant actually calls this part of the Civil War the darkest days for the Union side, because alongside this, of course, you see here like late August in the Eastern Theater. Meanwhile, you've got Second Manassas, where John Pope's army of Virginia got absolutely battered by the army of Northern Virginia at Second Manassas, and McClellan had already been decisively beaten in the 7 Days battles. So yeah, it's fair to say that alongside this offensive into Kentucky, which, if this offensive gone exactly the way the Confederates planned it to in terms of outcome, all the gains that U.S. Grant and Sherman and all the rest of them had made thus far with Tennessee, they'd have to go back to Kentucky, say the Western Kentucky. All their gains would have to be reversed, because, God knows, for example, you see here Louisville. Imagine the Confederate forces being in a position to deal with these railways, because you notice that these railways, especially, like, for example, I'm trying to think. Is it Springfield? I believe it is. State capital of Illinois would be around here. Massive railway junction, yeah. So imagine, yeah, if, for example, Confederates got to Louisville it can play havoc for strategic implications towards Union logistics in Western Tennessee and as the Vicksburg campaign later takes place. So yeah, this really was the darkest chapter for the Union side in me. Yeah, I gotta be honest. Like, I mean, I've been learning a lot about the Western theatre over the past month or so, because before, my knowledge largely went all around the Eastern theatre, and the Eastern theatre, of course, people know it for obvious reasons because how very politically important it was. Western theatre was really where the Civil War was won, I would say, because even after Gettysburg, it wasn't for like another year that the Union go up against Robert E. Lee again. Yeah, so that's the thing about the Western theatre was it was just constant hemorrhaging, and also because the Army of Tennessee under Bragg has, I suppose you could say, the headquarters of the Army of Tennessee under Bragg, probably had one of the most toxic working environments you can think of. So yeah, it's really a matter of a comedy of errors on the Western theatre for the Confederates, while in the Eastern theatre, you have the cream of a crop in guys such as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet. Someone like Pat Cleburne, as I will go to over the course of his stream, very capable guy, but his talents are wasted because it's often what happens is whatever Cleburne does well, another part of a line on the Confederate side does badly, and so Cleburne has to let up whenever he's finding success. So yeah, for example, so as I say, yeah, so Kirby Smith, however, he gets bottled up in Lexington rather stupidly because he knows that in Ohio, which would be like, I suppose here on the map, he knows that in Ohio they're drumming up volunteers to go down the railway to help out Buell and George H. Thomas in central Kentucky. Because at that point, because this is often what happens, yeah, every time there's a major Confederate advance, the Northern states panic and start drumming up loads of volunteers. I say volunteers, drafted in more like, but kind of like home guard militias drummed up to reinforce the armies in the field. And yeah, I mean, we have Braxton Bragg, so he takes Munfordville on September 17th. And really, Kirby Smith, I blame Kirby Smith more for what happened at this stage of the campaign where he just stays in Lexington. He doesn't bother sending a message or anything to Bragg saying, let's meet up at, let's say, Bardstown. Had they met up at Bardstown, they could have gotten to Louisville before Buell got there because Buell was very lethargic and very slow-paced. So yeah, it's really a matter of, even though there were issues on the part of Bragg and Kirby Smith, they still could have won this campaign because of how bad Buell as a general really was in terms of how lethargic and how slow-paced he was. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a fair point to say, yeah, because it really cuts the Confederacy in half, and it's also another thing I recently learned was so when eventually because one thing about Eastern Tennessee it's a very pro-union area, especially Knoxville, where very pro-union area. However, this area is more of a breadbasket of Confederacy than the Shenandoah Valley, because up until recently, I thought the Shenandoah Valley was a breadbasket of the Confederacy. However, it turned out to be more like Eastern Tennessee. So, in fact, you can argue in some ways that when Chattanooga falls later on in the war, that's actually more of a turning point in ways than even Gettysburg was. Because even with Gettysburg, Lee was still able to have a massive army and still able to defend himself pretty well. I've only watched the Shelby Foote clips of it. I haven't really watched the whole thing in general, but yeah, I've only watched Shelby Foote's interviews by Ken Burns, and yeah, I know Duke as well, the Iron Duke. It's something that he knows because I'm reading Shelby Foote, and I'm reading Shelby Foote in large part because of that Ken Burns interview with him. That took up. I listened to all 4 hours of it, which for anyone who hasn't listened to it, I'd say listen to it because when I'm reading Shelby Foote, I always read it in his voice, and that helps. And that's why Shelby Foote is probably one of the few historical writers where I don't have to bother taking notes of everything he says, because he writes in such a way that it's very much based on anecdotes, whereas a lot of history books I read they're all about dates and and that kind of thing, very sort of more logical kind of way of putting it, and that's why I have to take notes in a way that I don't have to do a show before. So yeah, so you see at September 22nd he gets into Bardstown, because one mistake Bragg makes is that between September 17th and September 20th, he just divers. It stays at Mumfordville rather than trying to, because at this point, time is of the essence. You've got this railway between Bowling Green and Louisville, and Kirby Smith, this is where I'd say it's 50-50 blame between Bragg and Kirby Smith, because Kirby Smith got himself too bungled up with Lexington, and he should have gone over to, let's say, somewhere like Perryville or Bardstown, and then waited for Bragg to join him. But instead he holds on to Lexington, and it just gets himself bottled up rather stupidly. But yeah, Bragg then goes to Bardstown, and then later on, tries to meet up with Kirby Smith around here, but Kirby Smith refuses to join him with Bragg with his 16,000 men by this point. But he's got reinforced, because Kirby Smith knows that if he joins up with Bragg, then Bragg gets supreme command of all Confederate forces in the area, because Bragg has seniority over him in terms of ranks. Because the way things work is, you might have, let's say, two generals who have the same rank, but if one guy was awarded before the other, the first guy gets commanded. The first guy outranks the second. So Kirby Smith, again, this is where I grow. This is where I hate to say it, but I'm siding with a bit more with Bragg in context of this campaign more than not, in terms of Kirby Smith really screwed him, because that's 16,000 men he really could have used for Perryville. And the thing was, so Perryville, you have something like 55,000 Union troops under Buell facing off against 20,000 under Bragg, and it's only by a God-given miracle that Bragg didn't get himself completely obliterated at Perryville. Yeah. So, for example, it says here, so you got Bragg and Kirby Smith are independent commanders. Kirby Smith only agrees to join with Bragg after the Battle of Perryville, which is why, after the campaign, Kirby Smith goes up to Jefferson Davis, bad mouthing Bragg. And I've got to be honest, Jefferson Davis should have sacked off both Kirby Smith and Bragg for this, because they both committed unforgivable errors in this campaign. But the thing about Bragg was he got on well with the one guy he needed most, and that was, of course, Jefferson Davis. So so you have 10,000 men under Kirby Smith. You do have Cleburne, who joins up with Bragg, and Bragg has something like they say 30,000 here, but only 20,000 were engaged. Meanwhile, it says 50, and at Perryville there were 55,000 Union troops, but only 16,000 were actually engaged for the entire battle. So it was really a miracle for the Confederates. They did go completely obliterated in October. And anyway, so Cleburne gets wounded at Richmond, as aforementioned, that's where he started growing the facial hair, because he's got a scar where the bullet pierced his cheek and every other cheek and tore out two of his teeth. So in a way, it's kind of a small miracle that he didn't get killed the way that happened. So this is kind of what happens with Perryville, where you see Cleburne here on the right flank under Hardee, because Anderson is a divisional commander under which Cleburne serves, and you see the ground here is just really awkward because it's very sort of hilly. You've got creeks and rivers running all over, but either side trying to attack would find it difficult because these creeks can break up momentum. Plus, you got the high ground, which can shield troops from artillery fire. So Cleburne, for example, uses reverse slopes as best he can to make sure his men don't get absolutely wrecked by Union artillery. I've heard Ken Burns is woke, but I haven't watched. Last thing I heard was he's doing something about the American Revolution and something about the Native Americans. That's the last I heard about it. I haven't watched it. Yeah, yeah, that's very much Shelby for it. Yeah, he's very much like I forget which film it was. There was a film done a few years ago where apparently a guy did a southern accent based upon Shelby Foote's voice. Rather blockbuster film, yeah. So I'm trying to think which one it was. I can't remember, but yeah. So you have Cleburne under Hardy, and yeah, so that's 2 p.m. at Perryville. An hour later, you get this general attack happens, and it's really a matter of the Union troops, a lot of them. So first to say, with this battle, it was really just a matter of comedy of errors on both sides. Because, for example, Leonidas Polk, he's purposefully insubordinate in this battle. There are times where he just orders troops to stay behind, even though they could have been used to the attack. And yeah, Leonidas Polk, I don't know too much about him, but from what little I know, it's a matter of he was an Episcopalian bishop before the war. He got his commission originally in the Mexican War because he happened to be the cousin of then President James K. Polk. James K. Polk, by the way, is one of the most underrated presidents in American history because I think he's the only president I know of who actually fulfilled all of his campaign promises, which, how rare is that in a politician these days? But yeah, so Leonidas Polk, big family in Tennessee, and yeah, you have Cleburne. Like Cleburne's men would be, I'm trying to think wherever it would be. They'd be like, I'm trying to think 38th Tennessee, I believe they were under Cleburne. It doesn't really mention here, but yeah, so they attack, and really it's just a matter of just frontal attacks. There's no, you can't really outflank them because you got these creeks, which means that if you try to outflank, for example, let's say Wharton's cavalry tried to get around, like the weather's just the ground is too difficult for it to cross. For example, if you try to get to the Dixville crossroads by getting around Wilson's Creek, it's just you'd be sitting a mile off, and it just wouldn't really work. And it's like you also notice here, like it's one of us not like a reserve Confederate force to try and get some cannons here up on, say, Peters Hill, for example, to go against Lytle and Rousseau's men under McCook here, and against McCook's corps around there. It's just both sides position their armies pretty awfully, it has to be said. For this battle, it's really just both sides commit so many errors that it's no wonder what Don Collis Buell after this gets the sack. So yeah, Cleburne, he is served under Buckner now at this point. I mean, they're fighting around Squire Bottom, crossing around here. A lot of regiments, very jam-packed area. Despite you've got, for example, you got 13th. So it says here 13th and 15th Arkansas. They had to be consolidated because back at Shiloh they suffered such heavy casualties that they had to be consolidated. That's what happens with a couple of Cleburne's regiments. After Shiloh, they had to be bunched up together because they suffered such heavy casualties that they had to be consolidated because there wasn't enough men to get back into those units and replenish. So that's what happens there. And yeah, so you see here the Union, they pull back, especially the likes of the 15th Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio regiments. And you have the Widow Gibson's house, which I believe a Widow Gibson, I think she was a woman in the 60s or 70s, and she got killed by a ricochet gunshot in the midst of a battle. And, one of those things where, it's just very sad misfortune of warfare at the time, where, a young, like an old woman just trying to hide as best she can in her own house just gets accidentally shot by some of the men, either Confederate side or Union side. It didn't mention the bullet, what caliber of bullet it was, but yeah. So yeah, you got Maney here who's having to pull back. So let's say for argument's sake, Cleburne was able to be successful for argument's sake. You have to pull back anyway because Maney and Stewart have to pull back their regiments from the onslaught from these 3 Union regiments. And I think there was you got Terrell here. Now Terrell, he was a friend of Philip Sheridan, because Philip Sheridan is commanding the division in this battle. I think somewhere safe of here, like I'm trying to think, like safe southwest Peters Hill. So Sheridan, Terrell, and two other divisional commanders whose name I forget. I think Starkweather was another one of them. I think Lytle was, or Webster. I forget which one. They made a bet that all four, that not that the majority of those four guys would survive the battle. As it turns out, Philip Sheridan was the only one of those four guys to survive. And Philip Sheridan, they were near death experiences throughout that battle. Like there were times where Philip Sheridan, I think it was like a cannonball that was headed for him, and he missed about 3 yards. Same with Patrick Cleburne at a later battle. Like there were just situations where you get these guys who become big names later on in the war who nearly get killed in battles like Perryville, and yeah. So yeah, this is where St. John Liddell, who is another Arkansas guy from who knows Cleburne personally, he tries to launch his attack at the last, but as you can see, the rest of the line, which kind of like a weird. I don't even know what it's kind of like, almost like a fish hook, but not, but kind of like a half-hearted fish hook. St. John Liddell's troops, of course, they get pushed back because the rest of the army at this point, they're too wearied. They can't really do much, and the battle kind of peters out. Now, as mentioned, so Buell had two corps in this battle that he could have engaged, and he could have obliterated Bragg's army where it stood because of a really bad position. Because you see, for example, Chaplin River, you see the river here, like you've got Cedar Bank around here. So had McCook been reinforced and done a counterattack, Cheatham, Hardy, Cleburne, Anderson, etc., all these guys around here, they would have been pushed to the wall, literally. They probably would have been obliterated had Buell reinforced them. But that was a massive missed opportunity for the Union. And, and there's a reason why Don Collis Buell gets the sack after this battle for obvious reasons, because, yeah, very rough fought. You know, a month, well, yeah, not sure, just shy of a month before, we have a battle of Antietam, which Antietam was really bad luck for Lee because of how McClellan found special orders that one of D.H. Hill's staff members left a copy of Lee's orders on a table in the town of Frederick, which was a Union supporting town. And those orders got picked up by a spy, sent off to McClellan, and that's how you, of course, get the Battle of Antietam. And that's how it kind of happened. Whereas this battle, Perryville, it's really a matter of, it was a tactically inconclusive, but strategically a Union victory because Bragg is forced to go back to Eastern Tennessee alongside Kirby Smith. But it really was just comedy of errors. Like, it's, you know, people think of Antietam as being like a bloody day and like very much a piecemeal assault, whereas this Battle of Perryville was just a comedy of errors. So many, just you can't really, you really can't sum it up other than to say that Perryville was just a massive, just two sides blundering against one another, and it was kind of like two mobs fighting each other because difficult terrain and all the rest of it. So that's one of the main reasons why amputations was so high in the Civil War. Like, for example, I think Shelby Foote says it in his book that after the Civil War, 20% of Mississippi's state revenues had to go towards furnishing artificial limbs for Confederate veterans from Mississippi, because so many soldiers from Mississippi had their arms and legs shredded by Minier bullets. For example, John Bell Hood, who I'll mention later, John Bell Hood had his left arm shattered by a Minier bullet, which meant that his arm lost most, if not all, of its function afterwards. And then another Minier musket ball shattered the femur in his right leg. And I pray to God I never suffer it myself, but I know this femur is the longest bone in the human body, and if you shatter that, you're in a world of pain. So if a mini ball shatters that femur, like chances are you won't be the same guy after that because of how much pain is incurred upon you. So yeah, and while I'm at it, and that's and the thing was so I'm not sure before he says in the Ken Burns documentary he says the main problem with the Civil War was that the weapons outpaced the tactics. The problem with that point of view is so the weapons more devastating. So you have canister shot and mini musket balls, which mean that if you're a guy standing out in line and you get hit by a musket ball or canister shot, you're gonna either by die from the fire itself, or you die from infection later afterwards because germ theory was only starting to be accepted in Europe and America. I mean, it was 1868, I believe it was, Louis Pasteur, just pasteurization. So germ theory was only really becoming a thing in Europe around this time, which is really bad luck for many of the wounded on both sides in the Civil War. And so that's what I would say with the weapons of the American Civil War was the tactics. The line warfare that you have about back then, that was the only kind of tactic you could do inside a battle because while the weapons were more devastating than they were with smoothbore muskets from Napoleonic Wars time, the weapons still have the same rate of fire. So you're still having to do the whole line linear warfare because basically cavalry can still tear into infantry like skirmishers if they're not properly protected, because the way that the weapons, like, you can only fire like 4 shots in a minute with these rifled and smoothbore muskets that both sides have in the Civil War. So that's the only critique. That's one critique I've got Shelby for. I think I think Americans overread at times how overwhelming the weapons were in terms of the tactics not catching up. I just think the tactics couldn't catch up because the weapons still have the same rate of fire, but they were more devastating, which is the worst of all worlds. I've seen pictures of them. I've never seen a mini ball up close or anything, but I've seen pictures, and very much like the Russians were on the receiving end of them, and after everyone knows a thin red line where the Scottish Highlanders, they ward off a Russian cavalry charge just by firing a couple of volleys, because the thing about the mini ball was it was accurate at 400 yards, which meant that when the Confederates attack, such as at Perryville, for example, they suffer heavy casualties, or Pickett's Charge, for example, or Malvern Hill, because the rifled musket is accurate at around 400 yards, and it decreasing from that. Whereas a smoothbore musket, which the Confederates largely have to deal with before Gettysburg. Gettysburg is the first battle where both sides are armed with the same small arms in terms of rifled muskets and rifled cannons. Before that, the Confederates had to work largely with smoothbore muskets, which were only accurate at 100 yards. So immediately with the Union, so when you look at these victories like Stonewall Jackson and the 7 Days battles under Robert E. Lee, the victories become even more astounding for the Confederates when you factor that the Union troops had a range advantage against the Confederates, because the Confederates had to wait until 100 yards and closer for their shots to have any effect, while the Union troops could start firing at them from 400 yards out. So I know. Because the Eastern Theater got the best weapons of the Union side, while the Western Theater, especially Vicksburg, for example, because it was a port, of course, they had better rifles, better rifled muskets at Vicksburg under Chauncey Pemberton than what U.S. Grant's forces had in that campaign. So it's kind of like, it's a bit of a myth. So logistics is a bit of a mishmash, where you got Lorentz rifles from Austria, you've got Palmettos from Italy, you've got Enfields from England, you've got model Springfields made in America. It's a really so many different calibers of rifles and muskets from that time. For example, the main musket in use for the Confederates was a model 1842 Springfield, while for the Union side, I believe it was that model 1855, that was a rifled musket. So it was only at Gettysburg that both sides are armed the same with a rifled musket. So yeah, uh, as you get into the New Year's Eve of 1862, you have a battle of Murfreesboro, which where is it on the map? Let's see if I can find it on the map. Where is it? Murfreesboro. Yeah, Murfreesboro, Middle Tennessee. Yeah. So Murfreesboro, yeah, where so you have Murfreesboro where you got so he called Murfreesboro by the Confederates, but Stones River by the Union because the way that both sides name their battles. So you have on the right flank Breckinridge attacking Crittenden. Now, the problem with this is the Stones River is too wide to be forded, so you've only got these bridges. So when later on in the battle, Hardee and Cleburne, especially, could do with reinforcements when they're attacking, and when they're fortifying later on, Breckinridge, his troops are on the wrong side of the river, and people will blame Breckinridge for this. I blame Bragg because Bragg chose this was an attack by Bragg. He could have picked better ground. Now Breckinridge, he was ordered to do this assault because you got that he has to cover the Confederate right flank for obvious reasons. So yeah, by the time Breckinridge, so you have his attack on 2nd January, but also his troops are not in no position to aid the rest of the army, under Polk and Cheatham and Hardee when they attack on the 31st of December. So yeah, you have this. So yeah, that's brief overview. Yeah, so yeah, you have Hardee, his corps mainly under the divisional command of McCarran and Cleburne, and then later, then you got Polk with his corps, especially under Cheatham and Withers. They're attacking. Again, this is just one of those battles where it didn't. Again, this didn't have to be fought this way because you see here that you've got the Stones River that bisects the battlefield. And then you've got Breckinridge's troops, which is part of Hardee's corps. Yeah. They're on the wrong side of the river to be reinforcing these guys in the event that. So even in the event that Cleburne, for example, with his troops were to achieve a breakthrough fighting McCook's corps on the Union right, they haven't got their troops are going to be exhausted and they haven't got Breckinridge's men to reinforce. So yeah, and you got Bragg over here in Murfreesboro nearby Lowell Creek. Yeah, and you got Polk as well, who he's get his men. But as you can see, it's like really just awkward terrain. You got Puckett Creek Creek here, and then you got Stones River. It's a really narrow battlefield as well. So the Confederates, I believe, were outnumbered at this battle, or at least anyway. The one thing they could have done is they could have, yeah, it was just a matter of poor positioning on Bragg again for this battle. Like, no other way to put it. I mean, you do have certain fords here for Breckinridge, but I said on the second ford, I thought I could only see the bridges on that one. But yeah, so you do have fords here. However, they're easily covered by so you have one ford here, for example, but one ford for an entire division. Yeah, it's not the best. And so for Breckinridge, you see his arrows here. They're reinforcing Hardee's corps, but it's really just awkward for both sides. And you have meanwhile, the Union left. They're trying to pin down Breckinridge as much as possible in the old year, December 1862, while McCarran and Wharton attack. Yeah, you got Hardee's corps. They attack against McCook's corps. You got Sheridan here, his division, fending off Cleburne and Cheatham and Withers here around here. Yeah, and they're fighting along the railroads because, of course, one thing you got to factor about the Civil War in the Western Theatre is it's either fought along rivers or railways for obvious reasons, because logistical reasons. So yeah, so that's what happens. Yeah, Then you have Wharton's cavalry. They managed to wheel past, while Hardy, he has to arrange his troops into it's almost shaped like a reverse tick. It's kind of like a V shape because they're going to attack around Blanton. And then you got Polk also synchronizing his assault. Breckinridge, meanwhile, he can only stay hold up because of Van Cleve here with his brigade. Well, Van Cleve's division, I should say, -1 brigade. Sorry. Yeah, but you just got this position where Breckinridge's division were hemmed in by the narrow breadth between the Stones River and Sinking Creek. So even in the event that Breckinridge has to assault later on and then try and cross the ford, it's going to take so much time and effort that it's really, as I said, it's just poor. It's really unfortunate the way the battlefield is shaped for Bragg the way it is. So yeah, you have the Union game steadily pushed back. So you have Wharton, for example, he's headed for the Nashville Turnpike because if he's able to achieve that, Rosecrans has his retreat cut because it's for reference. Rosecrans, this is the Army of Ohio. The Army of Ohio was the Union Army at the previously mentioned Battle of Perryville. Rosecrans replaced Don Carlos Buell, and I did mention Rosecrans in, I think it was Grant Part 1 or Part 2, where basically very popular guy, very charismatic and all the rest of it. However, he was too much of a diver. He wasn't the most resolute of guys, and Grant loses patience with him. Towards it. There's quite a few missed opportunities on Rosecrans' part, and he's not a great general. But I said, yeah, it's really a misfortune here that Breckinridge's divisions having to be like stationary because Van Cleve is having to pull back anyway. Now, people might say, well, why didn't I mean, perhaps Bragg could have had like a reserve brigade here or something, but I would personally have just done all the fighting. I personally would have just stayed in skirmishes around here to bluff the enemy into thinking there's a full-blown division here, while Breckinridge's main body of his troops. So do a bluffer here, while Breckinridge reinforces Hardy's assault. Because you see here, like, if Hardy's left wing manages to get Pierce all the way to here, where to meet the Stones River, Crittenden gets cut off easily, as well as perhaps George H. Thomas and Sheridan. Like, it's really an awkward situation for the Union where it is here. However, yeah, the lines start to peter out. So you have that Rosecrans, you've got Sheridan, you'll be here mirroring Cleburne. Wharton's cavalry doesn't get to manage to take the Nashville Turnpike, so that was a missed opportunity. Bragg, now he's ordering Breckinridge to reinforce, but that takes way too much time. So yeah, you have Polk attacking along the railway around Forest, which is kind of like not so big chunk of woodland. I would say like it's not. In some trees, like you can use the down logs in order to create some defensive positions, but no means like a massive forest or anything. Yeah. So, for example, I mean, you can see here, for example, right, Breckinridge, like Bragg orders Breckinridge to get here. I think Breckinridge, he should have tried to exploit this ford, at least bluff the Union into thinking that he's going to cross this ford. I suppose what I would have done if I was Breckinridge here, like I would have personally bluffed or put some artillery on Wayne's Hill to pierce against Crittenden's division around here, or Crittenden's corps. Sorry, especially Wood's division around here. But yeah, you see there's a Confederate battery here, but I think it's and then January 2nd, you then have the Union able to dispatch their troops across the ford, and you then have to have Polk. He has to send his troops around to reinforce Breckinridge on the right flank, and it's just a mess of errors. And you got Cleburne, whatever success he got to enjoy on his far left flank in previous parts of a battle, he's forced to have to pull back because the right flank is just having to reel under the pressure of onslaught from the Union. And yeah, so yeah, this is where eventually you get Breckenridge. Like you have a Union counterattack, especially on the Negley around Miss Ford, which yeah, so they have to fall back across the Stones River, and basically pretty much concludes the Battle of Stones River, which yeah, there's a reason why Braxton Bragg uh, doesn't really get much of a good reputation, and especially he has to retreat again, which by this point there's a lot of grumbling in the army, especially amongst the senior officers of the army like Polk, Hardy. They were writing letters to Jefferson Davis saying you need to sack off Bragg at some point because this guy's just a walking disaster zone. But Jefferson Davis sends Joseph E. Johnston to look at the army. Joseph E. Johnston, he doesn't want to rock the boat because a whole load of reasons that would take a lot of explaining. But so Joseph E. Johnston ends up just going, he just goes on the side of Bragg instead of siding against him, and in so doing, that gives Jefferson Davis the ammunition he needs to keep Bragg in position. So yeah, it's personally they would have done better to replace Bragg with someone like William J. Hardy. So yeah, before I get onto the Chattanooga campaign, so you get into later, and so you get into the latter end of into 1863. So in the latter half of 1863, before the Chattanooga campaign, what you have is Susan Tarleton, who's pictured here, they meet at William J. Hardy's wedding, and while the two are very shy towards one another, Patrick R. Cleburne, he's becoming a fair bit of a celebrity. Actually, I'm getting my dates wrong. Yeah, it's after Chattanooga. Sorry, I'm getting my dates wrong. Disregard. So yeah, between January and so you have the Battle of Chickamauga, which so you have Chickamauga, which there's a fair debate as to the question of whether the first day of Chickamauga. Sorry, there's a fair debate to say that the first day of Chickamauga was bloodier than Antietam, which, if that is the case, then first Chickamauga would be the bloodiest single day in American military history. But we don't know that for sure, so that's why. Yeah, that's why we still. That's why to this day it's still maintained that Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American military history. And yeah, so you have Chickamauga, which was a bloodbath. Cleburne does. I mean, Cleburne, his division are the spearhead of the assault, where on the right flank, where Rosecrans's army gets broken, because what happened was so at Chickamauga, what happened was you had I think it was a brigade where so Rosecrans, he feared that there was a portion of his line on the second day that there was a massive gap in the line, and he took troops from a part of his right to reinforce his left. In so doing, he created an actual gap, and the troops he fought that were the gap where he fought the place where he thought there was a gap. Actually, it turns out the troops there were using the they were using the brush and the terrain to their advantage to screen them from Confederate artillery fire. However, Rosecrans panicked and thought this was a line. There's a gap in the line, so he takes troops from his right flank to reinforce his left. Right as James Longstreet is coming in with his corps, because it's worth noting, this is September 1863, where you have Longstreet. He's sent over to the Western Theater because I think at that point he was a bit tired of Lee, because Lee screwed up at Gettysburg with Pickett's charge, especially. Longstreet wanted to get a break from him, so he appealed to get a transfer to the Western Theater, and Longstreet's corps is very much instrumental to the success of the Battle of Chickamauga. But that's where Battle of Chickamauga ends, and yeah, but I didn't put pictures for that for this stream just because, just to not confuse it with this battle of Chattanooga. So after Chickamauga, you've got uh, Union force under Rosecrans besieged around Chattanooga Way, which is an important railway junction in northwestern Georgia, where it meets with eastern Tennessee. And the thing was, yes, you have Cleburne on the far right flank here, and he's defending Tunnel Hill. It's called Tunnel Hill because it's nearby a railway tunnel, but also it's kind of like a gorge, like really great defensive ground. And also, if you're able to funnel Union troops into there, as what Cleburne does to Sherman's troops on the Union left, yeah, you're able to incur heavy casualties. And it's like, so for example, you got Tunnel Hill around here, Billy Goat Hill. Sherman took it thinking this was Tunnel Hill, so he inaccurately relays it to Grant, and a whole host of errors happens on the Union left that costs a lot of casualties, to say the least, for this. Now, before the main battle of Chattanooga, so to get myself how dysfunctional the Army of Tennessee was under Bragg. So you see here, like Chattanooga here, you've got a number of roads. So for example, McCook's Corps, they're coming in through this way. You've got Thomas's Corps coming through Stevens Gap and along McLemore's Cove, and you have Crittenden's Corps, which is coming along here. So you've got 3 separate corps coming in all at once. This is before Chickamauga, by the way, so just to not get confused. So what happens is, so you have Bragg. He tries, before the Battle of Chickamauga, Bragg tries to destroy the 3 separate corps in detail. However, he bungles it massively. For example, Hindman, the aforementioned Thomas C. Hindman, who was a friend of Cleburne, he's commanding a division alongside Cleburne. Hindman was meant to get to this Stevens Gap and close off Thomas's corps just as they try and attack Cleburne at Dugger Gap. However, Hindman, he gets given very contradictory orders by Bragg, where 1 minute he says attack, then 5 minutes later he says, oh, well, attack, but if you think there's too much resistance, pull back. So you imagine Hindman, he's probably thinking, well, what do I do now? Do I attack or do I stay put? Because you got the fact that Hindman, I think Hindman was a newer guy to divisional command than Cleburne was. So Hindman was a bit more cautious, and Bragg's constant vacillating just screwed over what chances the Confederates had of just nailing this defeat in detail. So you just have these. So Thomas, he realizes that his corps is getting into a bit of a trap, and he pulls back. So this is where Battle of Chickamauga just becomes a massive bloodfest and massively avoidable, were not for Bragg just being completely inept as a general. So to get onto the defense of Missionary Ridge, where you got Cleburne's division here on the far right flank. You've got Sherman bearing down from Billy Goat Hill. You've got Lucius Polk back here. This is not Leonidas Polk, Lucius Polk, his nephew. You got Granbury, who commands a brigade of Texans. You got Lewis and Lowry, who are also 2 other of his brigade commanders. They are fending off numerous assaults from Sherman, even to the point where, for example, you got Walcott, he's doing a multi-pronged assault. We got Lowry, he's not getting assaulted, but he's got guns and whatnot back able to try and break up Walcott's assault before they reach Lewis and Granbury. And fair to say that this part of the line saw some of the most ferocious combat of the entire Battle of Missionary Ridge in late November 1863. And as Richard Hughes would say, they were throwing rocks at this point. When some of the guys ran out of ammunition, they were throwing rocks down on Sherman's troops, for example. Now, whatever local success that Cleburne enjoyed, that was tempered by the fact that George H. Thomas, under orders from U.S. Grant, attacked the Confederate center. In so doing, this completely broken the Confederate army, and the Confederate army was forced to retreat. And even though Cleburne was a frontline division, he was picked to be the rear guard for what becomes a battle of Ringgold's Gap. So yeah, you can see here you've got defensive lines on Cleburne. Cleburne really, this is probably this. As I'll go through shortly, this is Cleburne's magnum opus of the defensive, where he uses the terrain most aptly along Missionary Ridge. Because, for example, one thing about Missionary Ridge, even though it's really high ground, Bragg, he knows full well that he can't reinforce. For example, Hooker is able to get Lookout Mountain and then charge through Rossville Gap and start assaulting Breckinridge's left. Bragg, for example, he can't get troops from, let's say, Hardy on the right to reinforce Breckinridge because the way that the ridge, how far along the ridge is and so on, you can't easily reinforce one section of a line by taking troops from another. Each section of a line has to defend with the troops they've got. So while Cleburne does his job really well, and he never needs reinforcement to do his job at Tunnel Hill, Hooker breaks through here, and with that, and when you have George H. Thomas attacking the Confederate center and Missionary Ridge, the battle's lost, and so you have after this, so a couple of days after Missionary Ridge, you then have Cleburne doing. Ringgold Gap is where he gets a nickname, Stonewall Jackson of the West, because people say that Cleburne defended here like in the same way that Stonewall Jackson defending Henry House Hill at First Manassas very much saved the Confederate Army from total annihilation by Irvin McDowell. So you have Cleburne, for example, you've got 32nd and 45th Mississippi. Again, that had to be consolidated. You've got all the way from it. You got Chickamauga Creek. You got Hooker. One thing Hooker didn't do for this, he didn't send skirmishers forth to probe. It's worth noting that Hooker, after because Hooker was still reeling at this point from what happened at Chancellorsville early on in 1863, where he absolutely got destroyed. Well, I won't say absolutely destroyed, but he got defeated pretty handily by Lee and Stonewall Jackson in what people would determine as Lee's greatest victory. And Hooker felt they had to make up for it by trying to destroy as much of Bragg's army as he possibly could. Very much too eager, I would say, because as I said, he didn't send any skirmishers to send forth to probe how strong the defense was. So you have, for example, you see here Granbury's forces are a bit further along than the rest of the curved line that Cleburne's got, because what happened was, here is most elevated, and what happens is you constantly having, let's say, the Union get up higher up in elevation, and then Cleburne would order his forces to counterattack, just as the Union troops are about to reach a plateau. In so doing, you are forcing down the enemy. It's kind of like what happened with the 20th Maine at Gettysburg at Little Round Top. You charge, almost swinging down like a door, so that you're able to just use your momentum right as the enemy is tiring after having ascended such a steep position. So you have they try to outflank here, but Govan with his men here with his 16th Alabama and his 6th and 7th Arkansas Consolidated Regiment, they're able to hold off any sort of outflanking move, especially with the 99th Ohio Regiment, as well as by Divisional General, as well as a Major General Islands Division with his New Yorkers, trying to also attack here along the creek, along the railroad. So yeah, it's fair to say this battle was really the magnum opus of Cleburne's military career by far, and this was the one factor that saved the army of Tennessee to fight another day. Because at this point, Bragg was a broken man. Like Samuel Watkins says in his book about the Chattanooga campaign, but at this point, Bragg was completely broken. Like he was almost like a broken child in terms of how he was looking at his entire battle plan missionary, which just fell apart. And it was only because of Cleburne that the army was able to not get completely obliterated. So yeah, I know that's one thing I do. I will mention when I eventually do my stream on Gettysburg on July the 3rd. So yeah, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I mean, as I mentioned 2 weeks back, he was referred to as a knightless soldier of the Union Army by General Gordon from the Confederate side. So yeah, very fine man for the Union side. So yeah, this is so not long after the Chattanooga campaign concluded, and you get the winter season where things tend to calm down because winter season's very wet. Of course, you can't march in the midst of winter. Cleburne and his mentor, William J. Hardy, they go to a wedding because William J. Hardy is getting wedded down in Mobile, Alabama, to his fiancée. While he's at the wedding reception, he meets Susan Tarleton, as pictured here. Now, Patrick R. Cleburne, to my recollection, he didn't have a relationship with any. Chances are, like, he was still he's still uninitiated as far as he still was a virgin, for example, by the time that he met Susan Tarleton, and he was in his mid-30s. So I imagine to some degree people might remark that Cleburne might well be somewhat on the spectrum, given how awkward he could be around women. But that's sort of retrospective. We don't know if that's true. And we know Stonewall Jackson certainly would be autistic in today's definition, like certainly with Stonewall Jackson, whereas Patrick R. Cleburne is a bit iffy because we don't know great detail about his personal life. And also a lot of the letters, for example, he wrote loads of letters to Susan Tarleton throughout 1864, but a lot of them, while some of the letters he wrote, he kept. The letters that it was something like, the letters she wrote to him, he kept hidden. And so we don't have a complete picture of how deep their relationship was. We know they got engaged. And although at first she wasn't willing to accept because she herself was very shy. Although it's worth noting, Cleburne at this point was a celebrity in the Confederate Army because after, as mentioned with Ringgold Gap, very much one of the most celebrated soldiers. Like, there's a reason why is that really that point he gets known as Stonewall Jackson of the West. And so this is where you get Patrick R. Cleburne, who meets the love of his life. Although unfortunately they never get married because unfortunately Cleburne dies, as a later detail. So in January and February 1864, while the army is on in their quarters preparing for the spring when the slaughter commences once more, Cleburne starts getting the idea that due to the manpower disadvantage that the Confederates have, because it's worth noting the Confederacy had 9 million people, of whom 4 million were slaves. So you got 5 million, of whom 2.5 million are men, and only so many of them can be drafted. Whereas the Union states in the North, they've got 22 million people. So, and also they've got a steady stream of immigrants from Ireland and Germany, as well as other places. So Cleburne, he starts entertaining the idea and actually writes a formal document. He starts talking to guys like William J. Hardy and others in the army that they ought to consider giving the slaves their freedom, as well as their families, of course, in exchange for their service fighting for the Confederate Army. Now, the brigadier generals under Cleburne, they're either supportive of it or at least they're muted in any sort of opposition to it. And William J. Hardy, he was actually entertaining it. Joseph E. Johnston, however, who at this point has replaced Bragg in charge of the Army of Tennessee, he doesn't pass it on to Jefferson Davis for obvious reasons, because he knows he's going to kick up a massive proverbial shitstorm, to say the least. So he doesn't send it on. But a certain guy by the name of W.H.T. Walker, WHT Walker here. He ends up sending the document over to Jefferson Davis, who orders that the document be destroyed and any copies of it disposed of. And it's reckoned at this point, Patrick R. Cleburne was blacklisted from ever being promoted ever again from Major General in his division, upward of to say possibly getting Corps Command. Now, William J. Hardy, there were opportunities where he could have been promoted, but he wasn't promoted, especially by William J. Hardy, who didn't feel he was up to it, because while Cleburne was an excellent divisional commander, it's reckoned that he wasn't really a solid corps commander because he was very quiet. He wasn't really much of a guy who created plans. He's the kind of guy who, he's kind of like a middle guy in a sense. He's not the one for creating plans. He's not, you can't imagine Patrick R. Cleburne being equal or someone like Longstreet or Jackson in terms of planning the battles, yeah. Yeah, because it's worth noting to add on to this. So in the midst of 1862, Jefferson Davis passes the Conscription Act. Part of it act exempts the Southern planters from joining up if they own, let's say, 100 slaves. So this is what is called the 100 Negro clause, which a lot of guys on the Confederate side were reeling about it. Like, they didn't particularly like it because they felt that the planters, a lot of them were very gung ho for the war, but were able to get out of it. So yeah, the thing was, so the vast majority of the army were, of course, the poor white Southern farmers. And the planters, especially someone like W.H.T. Walker, as pictured there, he's a Southern planter. When he hears of Cleburne's proposal to liberate the slaves in condition for military service, W.H.T. Walker, and as well as other guys like Joseph Wheeler in the Western Army, he very much, they're borderline Fed person saying they want to kill Cleburne for this. It was only because tempers flared up, and famously you got Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a planter by the point of the Civil War. He had a $1.5 million pound fortune. $1.5 million. So what does I say, pound? $1.5 million fortune before the war. But that's the thing about Nathan Bedford Forrest was that's why I wouldn't. But the thing was, he went up from private all the way to lieutenant general by the end of the war. Probably, I think that's the single biggest rise of any American soldier in the context of the American Civil War. So yeah, it's a matter of and it's really a matter of You do also get guys like W.H.T. Walker. You've got you do have also some political guys like Robert Toombs. You've got William Barksdale. I think he's a plantation owner. You do get a fair few plantation owners who do serve mainly as generals. But yeah, it's a matter of a lot of planters are also exempted. Now, Cleburne, for example, one argument he says is, well, look, because you are fact Cleburne did work as a lawyer before the Civil War, which there's not really great detail on that, so that's why I didn't really mention it in the pre-Civil War part of the stream. But Cleburne works as a lawyer prior to the war, and he used a lawyer's argument to say, for example, well, when the Christians were fighting the Battle of Lepanto against the Ottoman Navy in 1571, they said to their galley slaves, look, if you fight for us valiantly, you will get your freedom out of this battle. And Nathan Bedford Forrest, by the way, Forrest gave his slaves freedom in exchange for a military service. And even so, it was something like, he had something like because the thing about Forrest was he could be exempted from draft if he so desired, but he carried on fighting. But it was something like he had something like 68 slaves still stay with him after the war, even to a point where Union officers actually complimented him, saying, "Look, we truly knew that you were, truly you are a great man. Because look at this, even your Negroes are staying to fight with you, even to the bitter end." So that's kind of I know Custer office Custer, I think he was a lieutenant, I believe, because technically he did climb up to I think it was climbed up to a rank of like colonel or something like that by the time of the Civil War, but regular versus volunteer ranks. and so Custer went back down to went back to Lieutenant Colonel, I think it was, after the Civil War was done. Yeah, Jeff Davis actually had a plantation south of Vicksburg, which is why he puts John C. Pemberton in charge of Vicksburg. Why he does, because he knows John C. Pemberton, as a personal friend of his, will not falter in holding Vicksburg, and that's also why he screws over Joseph E. Johnston in that specific campaign, because he felt that Johnston wasn't gung ho enough to defend Mississippi, which I just think, yeah, it's a matter of. I just think it's a matter of Jefferson Davis screws over guys who actually were, because I'm going to be mentioning the Atlanta campaign in a short while, which I already mentioned before on William T. Sherman, but Joseph E. Johnston was probably, he gets really crapped upon, even including by Shelby Foote, and I think Shelby Foote's critiques of him, I get where Shelby Foote comes from, but Joseph E. Johnston was probably one of the few Confederate generals who was thinking strategically. He knew full well that the best thing you can do is a Fabian strategy to try and tire out the federal armies and use the, because you got to factor the Confederate states, the distance between like Texas, like western, like El Paso, Texas, all the way to like Richmond, is greater than the distance between Paris and Moscow. That's how big the Confederacy was. So they had plenty of land to try and play ball with in the context of the Civil War. So that's a thing, yeah. The Confederacy could have played more of a Fabian strategy, and I think Shelby Foote, he falls to that southern bravado kind of thing where they constantly think of the attack, and it's, I just think Joseph E. Johnston was probably the best guy the Confederates had at this stage of the war, especially. I'm going to be reading a multi-volume biography of Andrew Jackson later this year. So, the only biography I know of is by Remini. I forget his first name, but he was like a congressional historian from the 70s, I believe. So, might well be that, because I've heard Remini. He's probably one of the best historians in terms of reading about Andrew Jackson, because he's very nuanced and doesn't. Because I know a lot of people nowadays, unfortunately, they do play the moralizing card about Andrew Jackson, especially for Trail of Tears. Yeah, that's the thing about the Confed. That's the thing about that's the thing about the Confederacy. It was a massive country, So you go from Texas, like let's say El Paso, right on the Mexican border, all the way to like Richmond. Yeah, that's a greater distance than between Paris and Moscow. Like that. That's just how massive Confederacy was. To get onto the Atlanta campaign. So, Atlanta campaign, so Joseph E. Johnston, he defends first at Dalton, where only because he got outflanked by especially McPherson, who so McPherson pushes onto Resaca in mid-May, and the thing about that was McPherson, he dithered, and I reckon the main reason he dithered was because he believed erroneously that Cleburne was in the Resaca area, because McPherson at that point he was in charge of corps. He feared that if he were to send his entire corps against Cleburne defending Resaca, he'd be repulsed, and he didn't want to suffer heavy casualties. And so, that was a massive missed opportunity where Joseph E. Johnston could have had his retreat and supplies cut had McPherson taken over Resaca. But instead, Joseph E. Johnston caught on to what was happening and managed to get the heck out of Dodge. So by the time, he goes over to... So, for example, he tried to defend here at Adairsville, but the ground wasn't suitable. Then he tries to defend here at Cartersville, just before the Etowah River, which again, the Union outflank him. And then, you have these string of battles to the northwest, where, for example, you got, for example, New Hope Church, you've got Pickett's Mill, which I will be talking about. I'll focus a lot more Pickett's Mill and Kennesaw Mountain, because those are the two battles of this campaign before the battle for Atlanta itself that Cleburne really shines through in. So yeah, you have Pickett's Mill, where Cleburne decisions he makes in a battle really save the Confederacy from getting obliterated. There's also Peachtree Creek, which that's another battle where Jumbo Hood applies a lot of stick to Cleburne. And by the end of the stream, I mean, I already had a dislike towards Jumbo Hood, but when I look at what Jumbo Hood said to Cleburne, from Peachtree Creek onward, I really begin to loathe Jumbo Hood as a general, because what he said to Patrick R. Cleburne, yeah, very unjust how he treated Cleburne, accusing him of cowardice of all things, which, yeah, I really am not a fan of Jumbo Hood, and I think Jumbo Hood was a true idiot, to say the least. And yet you have Cassville, for example, as you can see here, where this was meant to be good defensive ground, but Hood, for whatever reason, he just lets a federal column just walk right past him. Basically, yeah, he didn't know, yeah, just so I mean he has to pull back, and then they have to pull back again because of Union outflanks, because it was meant to be like a massive ambush, but Hood then later complained of enfilading fire done on his right flank when we were meant to do the ambush. So yeah, I mean, this is a really simplistic map. Basically, you got Cleburne. He's got his division on the left flank. However, he notices that he needs to reinforce the right flank, and this is where, you know, had he had the foresight to know that this cavalry, for example, would not be able to hold against, for example, let's say Scribner attacks here, that could really just do an envelopment of Cleburne's entire division. So yeah, and so you have Granbury here, you got Lowry here. I mean, you got Lucius Polk and Govan. They have to reinforce along the right flank, and this saves this particular Confederate army from complete disaster. And yeah, this is like a remnant of a trench. You can still see today around the battlefield of Pickett's Mill where Cleburne's men would have dug in. Yeah, so Kennesaw Mountain. Where's Cleburne? Cleburne will be here. Yeah, so you have all along the line here where Kennesaw Mountain, basically what happened was Sherman was getting increasingly angry with the fact that he could not pin down Johnston's army. So at this point, he stupidly goes on a frontal attack. And by the end of the battle, it's something like the casualty count is something like twice or thrice in favor of the Confederates. Like, with this battle, I mean, after this battle, Joseph E. Johnston gets the sack because basically Jefferson Davis was done with him constantly retreating and pulling back. But Kennesaw Mountain vindicated what Joseph E. Johnston was doing, where Sherman just lost his temper, forced his army into a frontal attack, which has cost the army a load of casualties. But because it's worth noting, with Grant, the way he did the Overland campaign, he could afford heavy casualties. Sherman couldn't, in that same sense, because he has to constantly garrison places in northern Georgia along the way. So his army is like, so by this point of the campaign before Kennesaw Mountain, it's Johnston. He reckons with reasonable accuracy that Sherman's lost something like 25 to 30,000 men to attrition. So this strategy that Johnston was implicated was using really was paying off. And you see here, like you got, for example, places like Pigeon Hill, which as I said, it's a small hill, but yeah, Kennesaw Mountain named so. Yeah, and then you've got you've also got a lot of these creeks that help to shield the flanks. And even though you've got Hobson, for example, he tries to circle around Hood, it's just really a matter of really poor choice by Sherman to fight this battle. Really didn't have to fight this battle. Just it was avoidable, yeah. And you got Cleburne side by side with Cheatham under Hardy, and they're dealing with the Army of Cumberland under George H. Thomas. I mean, we've got Sherman in the center trying to take on Little Kennesaw, but yeah, basically all attacks got reported, especially George H. Thomas's men under being repulsed by Cleburne with the way they happened in front of a town of Marietta. So yeah, this is what the Confederate positions would have been like a Kennesaw Mountain with the trenches. So you would imagine like the domineering side they would have had over the battlefield, especially a little and big Kennesaw Mountain of these massively steep hills. Meanwhile, I believe this is Little Kennesaw Mountain or Pigeon Hill, either one of them, and this is where the Union troops would have set out from to attack. So, yeah, you understand how it was that Sherman's troops got easily repulsed by Johnston's army. So Peachtree Creek, what happens is Cleburne was held in reserve, and you have guys like Walker and Baker attacking. Yeah, you see here Hooker with his 20th Corps. You got Palmer with his 14th Corps. I mean, you got Newton with his 4th Corps. They're defending against a sustained Confederate onslaught. Because you see Confederate entrenchments along here. They sallied out because at this point, yeah. So yeah, at this point, yeah. So you got you do have some roads here where your Peachtree Creek, which is obviously where the name of battle comes from. And yeah, you see Peachtree Creek is around around up here. Yeah, out of defensive line here, you got Peachtree Creek. Like this would be where the battle was fought, so northeast of Atlanta, which is at this point, yeah, you got Jumbo Hood, I believe, in charge of the army at this point. This is what we now call the battles for Atlanta. So yeah, you've got so yeah, you have Jumbo Hood in charge of the army, and of course, Sherman was very much elated when he saw that Hood was in charge, because as you can see around Atlanta, you've got these densely packed entrenchments, which Johnston had built up. Now, had Johnston been in charge, I think even if Sherman took Atlanta, I think Johnston probably could have done the counterattack later on, because I know like Shelby Foote would say Johnston was too much of a perfectionist regarding the circumstances in which he wanted to wage a battle on the offensive. However, Johnston's strategy was really paying off, and I think even in the event that Sherman was able to take Atlanta, I think Johnston would probably have counterattacked at a later point. And yeah, I think the main sin that Johnston made was he never cleared his strategy with Jefferson Davis. To be fair, they never got on anyway. But the thing is, you can understand why Jefferson Davis gets irked off by constant retreating on the part of Johnston. So I can see both sides as to why Johnston was removed at this point. And Cleburne wasn't public with his emotions, but he was fairly miffed, to say the least, about the fact that Johnston had been taken out, because the troops on the ground, they knew for what Johnston was probably the best guy they had. I mean, I didn't particularly like Jumbo Hood, because Jumbo Hood was a newcomer to the army. He's only been in the army for like 6 months. Meanwhile, William J. Hardy had seniority. He was the most senior lieutenant general in the army by far, and he should have been promoted. But Jefferson Davis passed over him to promote Jumbo Hood, who was a massive sycophant of Davis's. So, yeah, a lot of discord within the Federal Army of Tennessee by this part of the campaign, which was also stupid anyway, because why would you replace your commander in the midst of a military campaign, no less? Yeah, so here you got the Battle of Jonesboro, where you've got there's a lot of controversy that Jumbo Hood blames Cleburne, especially, as being cowardly and that he didn't pursue the advantage enough. Well, the thing was, so you have Clayton and S.D. Lee. S.D. Lee, by the way, he was one of Nathan Burton Forrest's previous superior officers. However, he got to take over a corps. And the thing about S.D. Lee was he was a guy from North Carolina or South Carolina, and he was a distant cousin of Robert E. Lee. So yeah, he leads a corps to attack these well dug in Union troops under like Hazen and Howell, while Cleburne's men are attacking along like the Flint River, as well as against Logan's corps around here nearby Jonesboro. Now, Hardy, he knew a bit. Later on, he sees that the After SD Lee's men are repulsed by Hazen and Harrow, he orders the attack to be called off by Cleburne's division, and that's really when, that's when the battle's pretty much over. And John Bell Hood really, as I would reiterate, he was a true idiot. I just look at him and go, yeah, I when I was reading Craig L. Simon's book, which I'll put as a source later on in the comments after the stream is done. I already had a dislike of Jumbo Hood, but I could understand him in terms of the fact that, well, he did suffer PTSD from his two grievous wounds at Gettysburg and Chickamauga, but the way they accuse it constantly, guys like Cleburne and Hardy and so on, of almost like treachery and cowardice, I just think, I just grow to loathe what Jumbo Hood put. But you get into November. So after the Atlanta campaign is done and dusted, Jumbo Hood, he has the idea of marching through northern Georgia into Tennessee, and he aims to get into Virginia, by which he can join with Robert E. Lee, because he hypothesizes that the Union don't have many troops to defend Middle Tennessee, especially Nashville, because at this point, like even at this point of the war, where everyone could tell the war was lost, the Confederacy was still reeling of the fact that they still lost Nashville back in March 1862, and John Bell Hood pledged to get back, even though it would have served no strategic use, really. And what volunteers he could have got, well, the game's too late anyway, but So he goes over into Middle Tennessee at a place called Spring Hill. As you can see here, you have Cleburne's men, and you got Cheatham's corps, as well as Hood's army. Yeah, they come up the Valley Hill Pike and may attack along the town of Spring Hill. Now, there's a fatal error that happens where Cheatham and Cleburne, they were both told by Hood to take. They were both told initially to take Spring Hill, but then Hood says take the Franklin Columbia Turnpike Road here, which goes through the town. However, Hood did not properly communicate it to them. So Cheatham is under the impression that he only has to take the town, and that's it, because he knows the Union Army are pulling back towards Nashville, and he wants to destroy them before they can reinforce Nashville. Now, Cleburne, he advances up here nearby where the turnpike is. However, Bate, he advances up along here. There's a big gap between Bate and Cleburne. So what they both do is they camp closer to one another, but also further away from the turnpike. So in the night, Schofield's entire corps just goes up his turnpike in the dead of night. It was like 100 yards, something like that, away. So both sides knew each other were in the area. And it was one of the most surreal things in the entire Civil War, where Schofield's entire army corps were just going up through this road in the dead of night. The marching and all the rest of it, the sounds they were making was clearly audible to Cleburne and Bates divisions. But basically what happens is they didn't stop the Schofield's army. Now, Jumbo Hood accuses Cleburne especially of being lackluster and refusing to destroy the army and being a coward and all the rest of it, which, that was complete BS, because Hood did not communicate to Cheatham and especially Cleburne his intentions regarding the turnpike. So instead, it was just a matter of Jumbo Hood just being god awful as a commander in terms of communication. Like, he pictured that he would destroy these armies in the same way that Lee imagined he could destroy McClellan in the 7 Days battles. But as the old saying goes, a plan does not survive contact with the enemy. And there's a lot of friction between what reality brings versus what was on paper a good plan. So, yeah. So yeah, you have the evening where you just have this federal march just going through the town, and it's surreal. So there's like one of those events in Civil War history where you think, how the hell did it happen like this? And it's like your Forest cavalry as well. Like Forrest knew as well that there were troops going through Spring Hill, but after his experience with Charlotte, I mean, it's also worth noting, but yeah, John Bell Hood also blamed Forrest in part for what happened at Spring Hill, but also Forrest was unjustly blamed because in early November he attacked a bunch of gunboats on the Mississippi River nearby a place called Johnsonville, and Hood was left waiting for him longer than he intended for Forrest to join him. So yeah, it's a matter of John Bell Hood really just antagonized people. So Cleburne and Forrest are the two most brilliant guys on the Western Theatre for the Confederate side, without question. And Hood fought it with both of them by this point. So yeah, now I'm going into the Battle of Franklin, which is sadly the day where Cleburne gets killed. So, as mentioned, this is a hill where this is what Hood would have seen on the day. So, for example, if you go back, so 29th of November, this was Spring Hill. 30th, so Battle of Franklin takes place the very next day on the 30th of November, and this is what John Bell Hood would have seen atop the hill in which he was reconnoitering the Federal positions. He would have seen a well dug in Federal force under Schofield around the town of Franklin. And as you can see here from this map, so Forrest advocated for crossing these two fords, McGavock's and Hughes Ford, to try and cut the Murfreesboro Road and the Nashville-Decatur Railroad, and just cut off Schofield's escape, because Schofield probably would have been starved out into a point where he would have been forced to attack across the Harpeth River against, let's say, for example, you see hills around here. Like Hood could have interposed between Schofield and Nashville in the same way that Longstreet was proposing for Lee to interpose between Meade and Washington at Gettysburg, but Hood, like Lee at Gettysburg, didn't listen, and instead he just ordered a general attack. And in fact, like Hood actually went up to Cleburne saying, "Will you do as you ordered?" And Cleburne says words to the effect of, "I will take those enemy positions or fall in the attempt." And the latter part of that saying is really what happens, where you have, and you see the utter foolishness of what John Bell Hood planned. What utter foolishness, because he didn't even attack the entire Union line. He just attacked a portion of it. So you got Kimball's men, for example, on the Union right. They don't get a single Confederate aiming their way. It's just Riley and Wagner and Ruger who are just dealing with the onslaught of the Confederate army. Sorry, Wagner. Wagner did have his troops arrayed in like an advanced defensive position, but it was stupid. And Emerson Updike, who's somewhere around here, it would be Emerson Updike. He basically told Wagner to go F himself if he was going to order Updike's men to defend this advanced defensive position that Updike and a guy from Ohio knew to be utter folly. So yeah, the attack around 4:30, and really the attack was piecemeal, where this part of the attack happens at 4:30. Well, 7 p.m. is where you get where S.D. Lee's troops, S.D. Lee gets wounded and Johnson has to command in his place. It was like Chalmers with his cavalry charging against a portion of Kimball's line. But yeah, you got all these Federal batteries that just have real rich pickings along this open field. So for reference, Pickett's charge had 12,000 men engaged on the Confederate side, marching along 3/4 of a mile across open ground. Battle of Franklin, meanwhile, was 20,000 Confederates marching across 1.5 miles of open ground against a well-dug-in Union defensive position. So, in a way, Hood got what he wanted in terms of wanting to be like Robert E. Lee, but he did even worse mistakes than what Lee did at Pickett's Charge and Malvern Hill. So yeah, you have There was one time where Cleburne's division actually broke a part of a line, especially when they knew of a cotton gin and the Carter House. However, Opdyke with his division, they come in just in the nick of time to throw back Cleburne's men, which that was the last and only time Cleburne's division with his men were chucked back. And as you can see, X marks the spot here. That's where Cleburne was killed, where a bullet right to the heart, where he was shot and killed instantly. The men instantly knew he was dead by the fact that when Opdyke's men were repulsing them, normally Cleburne would be ordering them, like rattling his saber, saying, "We need to get on over them, get on over them." But the fact that Cleburne wasn't around ordering that, they knew he was dead by that point. They didn't even have to see his body; they knew he was dead because they knew intuitively. If he wasn't there ordering them to go on the offensive, they knew he was dead. And a lot what Spooper had broke soon thereafter. And yeah, it's a matter of they were forced to pull back. Granbury, also, the guy charging, he leads a Texas brigade. He gets shot right beneath his right eye and killed instantly. Yeah, really disastrous battle. As you can see, there's a monument here at Winstead Hill. This is where John Bell Hood would have been observing the battle. This is where there's a monument to Cleburne, safe wood of the town of Franklin in Tennessee. So yeah, Franklin was really just a massive tragedy born by a general who refused to listen to Cleburne and Forrest regarding, outflanking the Union Army. And Cleburne, he was basically guilt tripped into mounting the attack into a stupid position. And this is where I don't think it's hyperbolic admits that I loathe John Bell Hood. I mean, I was willing to give him allowance given the two massive injuries he suffered in previous bloody battles at Gettysburg and Chickamauga, but after how he treated Cleburne, yeah, that's why I can go this point. So yeah, this is Lucius Polk. He was one of the closest friends, and he was actually nephew of Leonidas Polk. He hated Braxton Bragg, and he was forced to leave the army when he got wounded in June of 1864. Daniel C. Govan, who I think he was Scottish heritage. He was also Scots, I believe, if I remember correctly. Mississippian. He moved over to Helena, and he was part of Cleburne's regiment from the get-go. And then he got promoted to brigadier general after Stone's River, and he was at every battle with Cleburne from Chickamauga to Franklin. Here's Granbury, the guy who he was originally from Mississippi, but he moved over to Texas. He leads his Texas brigade at Franklin, but he gets killed he gets shot right here on his face with a dot you imagine bullet wound right here on his face. I mean, we've got Mark P. Lowry, who looks like John Brown to me. I don't know if really odd how much he looks like John Brown here, to my reckoning, especially with the eyes. But yeah, so yeah, you have Jones, like Mark P. Lowry, who he was a very capable brigadier general, especially at Jonesboro, where even despite the miscommunication, he did serve fairly loyally. Yeah, but there's an element of I don't really blame Lowry so much for that defeat, but yeah, I remember Susan Tarleton. So yeah, Susan Tarleton, when she heard of Cleburne's death, she wore black for a year. She did eventually marry, but she died in 1868. They reckon from heartbreak from Cleburne's death that she never really recovered from the news of Cleburne's death. And even though they never married, even when they never got to get married, Susan Tarleton, safe to say, she died of a broken heart from Cleburne's death. And she didn't have any children of her own, so she died. She would have been 25 in 1864. So yeah, you imagine she died literally 4 years later. So she wasn't even 30 when she died of a broken heart from Cleburne's death. And yeah, very tragic woman considering the circumstances. And yeah, um, so to tail off here, yeah, this is where the thumbnail comes from. I don't know which battle this is, but yeah, this is this blue divisional flag. Cleburne's division was the only division in the entire army that was allowed its own battle flag, which that's probably the highest accolade you can get in the army of that time, where you have your own battle flag, no less, because it's like most troops would have been flying, of course, the Confederate battle flag, the usual like red stars and stripes and all the rest of it. However, Cleburne got his own, and yeah, here, this is probably my favorite. I mean, you got Tucker Carlson here, no less. You got Tucker Carlson being a time traveler serving under Cleburne. I think this was judging by the trees around here, I think this is Shiloh. But if this is Shiloh, then it's a bit erroneous that he's got facial hair because, well, because he didn't have facial hair at the time. It was only after Battle of Richmond in the latter half of 1862, during the Kentucky campaign, that you actually get him growing his beard, of course, to hide the scars. This battle, I think this was a battle of Franklin, I believe. This is where famously this is not long. It's not long. It's around this time, yeah, because it's like you got immense fog, you got well dug in Union troops. I think this is Battle of Franklin, and not long after this year, this is where Cleburne gets a shot to the heart and he dies instantly. And then yeah, you've got Cleburne with his men on the rest. I think this is during the Atlanta campaign, though could be wrong. Either at Kentucky or Atlanta. Yeah, that's actually a good question. I didn't look into that deeply. Yeah, because it's worth noting. So you do have on the side of, for example, you have in Mississippi they have the Van Dorn design, so it's like a red field with a crescent and stars. So for a Mississippi regiment, while for the Arkansas regiments, especially under Cleburne, they do have that blue field with a moon. So in the Confederate Army, you would have had a lot of regimental battle flags, but in terms of a divisional one, Cleburne's division was the only one in the Confederate Army of Tennessee that had its own special flag that only they themselves could fly. Yeah, I know P.G.T. Bogart did design the Confederate battle flag, and it was largely flown, especially in many battles. Like, for example, you see here, you've got the Confederate battle flag, and you've got an Arkansas flag. I think that's Arkansas. I can't see it in great detail, but yeah, you would have had flags flown side by side because you got to factor the Confederate states were very much of a sort of decentralized kind of apparatus. So that's what. So different states have different battle flags, but yeah, it's fair to say that Cleburne's division really had the only one with the accolades of having their own specially made divisional flag, because usually it'd just be regimental, or failing that you just have a standard Confederate battle flag as shown here. But yeah, you do have so yeah, that's I believe that's how the way it went. You see, you would have had regimental flags in this war on the Confederate side. I don't know too much of the Union side. I haven't looked into the Union side, but for the Confederate side, yeah, regimental flags based on of states were very much a thing. But yeah, if you didn't fly your state flag, then you genuinely would fly this, and yeah. So yeah, so yeah, believe yeah that concludes the life of Patrick R. Cleburne. I would say I can see why he wasn't promoted to corps command, because the general narrative is that Cleburne wasn't promoted because he was blacklisted from that document where he proposed freeing the slaves in exchange for their freedom if they fight for freeing the slaves in exchange for military service had they chosen to, because the numbers he was coming up with, like 300 to 400,000, so that's like a tenth of the slaves in the Confederate States. But yeah, basically, a massive thing. Had they gone for all that, it would have probably prolonged the war, because there were a great deal of many slaves who probably would have fought with the Confederates. Because it's worth noting, one thing that's never taught is that, so everyone knows of the radical Republicans who were supported by the blacks after the Civil War. However, by the early to mid 1870s, especially in U.S. Grant's second term, the blacks stopped voting Republican as much. Like they started to cotton onto, they started believing that they were being taken advantage of as a sort of proxy for revenge against the South. Which is why, for example, one thing that doesn't really, that people are surprised by, so by people I mean normies, not people in our circles. Nathan Burton Forrest was going to all these African American events in the 1870s where he would just say to the blacks, "Look, do not vote Republican because they're just going to use you," and the blacks ended up agreeing more with him than not on that one. Like the blacks actually had a lot of cordiality with Nathan Burton Forrest, and it's worth noting, as mentioned, someone like Nathan Burton Forrest was known to be a very good. Like, I know, like it'll be controversial to say because basically there's no sense of nuance about how a lot of people view the slavery question, but someone like Forrest was actually, like, as far as slave owners go, Forrest, for example, was one of the best guys in terms of being a slave owner, because yeah, sure, he had a vicious temper, but other than that, he was a very nice guy. I mean, one thing about him, despite being like the really tall, menacing guy he had like a really soft voice, which is like it's like A.R. Shiratori, like, or William Grenville, like, he's got like a soft-spoken voice, even though he's like 6'8". Like that's one thing I always find funny. Is like you get these really tall guys, or really like guys who can, I imagine, can look menacing in real life or like intimidating, and yet they have a softest voices. Whereas you got me, I'm not exactly a tall guy by any means, but then you've got guys who are short. Like you got shorter, like guys like me who have a really deep voice, which is, I just find funny. Coincidence. Yeah, I know. Benedict Cumberbatch, like the slave owner he plays. There's a lot of people who just have no sense of nuance and look at that guy because they go, oh well, he tore a mother from the daughter, and it's like, well, and it's like you've got the slave trader who very much was going to use a 12-year-old girl in future as like a likely girl, which is like to say for sexual kind of slaves. Whereas you do get good slave owners, and it's like, I mean, Stonewall Jackson was another guy who was benevolent towards his slaves. Like I know, like I think it's Aton Shea who I noticed their reputation's gone through the mud lately. That guy is just that guy. There's a few clips about him surfacing. Aton Shea, like, he said, "Oh, well, Stonewall Jackson owned slaves," and it's like, well, okay, but the slaves that Stonewall Jackson had, they had held no ill will against him. And that's the thing. It's like it's one things where there are plenty of guys in the South who, yeah, they were quite good to their slaves. I mean, it's one of the things where to a modern normie, they can't grasp it, whereas people in our circles can, which is why it's one of the things where when you try to say, well, there's a such thing as a good slave owner, it's like there's no sense of nuance when you're talking to like a normie or someone on the left, which is annoying. Whereas in our circles, there's a lot more nuance in how people approach it, and yeah, so yeah, I mean, Cleburne, I mean, in the epilogue of that book, which I'll show later, in the epilogue, it says that Cleburne was very much, he was a Confederate citizen more by duty rather than like what, because he was very much adopted as a Confederate because he got that, of course, he was an Irishman. One thing about him was, so even though by the time of the Civil War, he started getting a bit of a more of an American accent, because even in the heat of battle, his Irish accent would come out. So when he says the word charge, he really pronounces it. He really goes with the R's. He really rolls the R's in a very Irish way, which would seem very atypical to, let's say, a guy from Mississippi or Tennessee or Arkansas. So yeah, that's one funny thing. Like, if you want to imagine how Patrick R. Cleburne would have sounded, imagine like a soft-spoken Irishman who could also sound like a fury saying "charge" with a really emphasized R. And yeah, that's I'm massive. And the thing about Cleburne was he was he was very much with the South, except on the question of slavery. He did not understand how keenly the South held on to slavery, because Cleburne was of a perspective that the North only used slavery as a moral cudgel, because there is the argument. I mean, and I think it's a fair argument to say that basically what happened was the Civil War. It was a long time coming, because even without slavery, you still had conflicts between the industrialized and financial North versus the agrarian South. So, for example, when the Louisiana Purchase happened, I think there were states in New England that were threatened to secede unless certain conditions were met by Jefferson regarding the expansion of slavery with the Louisiana Purchase territories. So, when people say secession was all the southern thing, well, there were northern states who threatened to secede donkey's years before the South did in the 1860s, which that never gets talked about. Yeah, so Patrick R. Cleburne, he was very much of the opinion that even without slavery, the South was still, he believed that the North would still have gunned on for the South, regardless of whether slavery was a thing or not, because of the sort of economic struggle between the agrarian South versus the industrialized North. And I'm minded to agree with that, but also it's fair enough to say slavery was an important thing in the Civil War, because I mean, look how Jefferson Davis screwed over. Look how W.H.T. Walker and all the others. A lot of these guys screwed over Cleburne when he suggested perhaps freeing a big chunk of the slaves. Big chunk of a slave population in exchange for military service. It's a really nuanced question, because it's like I do believe that if slavery never happened, I still think perhaps the Civil War might have gone on the way, might have happened because of northern versus southern economics, basically. Yeah, I think the South, especially South Carolina, Virginia, and so on. The only reason they went to New England in rebelling against us was we had a guy called Lord Dunmore. He was a general. He stupidly said any slave that joins the British Army would be granted their freedom. In so doing, he basically created the conditions for slaves to rebel against their masters in Virginia, and that was a massive anxiety on part of like Virginians and North Carolinians and South Carolinians and Georgians and so on. The idea that the slaves were going to start to get uppity because the British Army was possibly going to give them freedom in exchange for military service, which massively unforced ever on part of the British general. But but that's just history, and and that's the thing. Yeah, you have that was the thing. Is like the North also was willing to secede previously in the past, because when the Southerners were so gung ho for the Louisiana Purchase, they were planning to expand slavery, but they had to do a compromise. Otherwise, the North would have seceded. So yeah. I mean, I think Jefferson probably had the best. Like, I think Jefferson's view of slavery was probably the view of many Southerners, which was, well, slavery is in itself not a good system, but it's the only system that can work down south, because you need cheap, because the thing was there was an abundance of land but not enough labor, and the thing was the planters could not afford the high wages that the poor white farmers would have asked for to do that kind of work. So in the end, they had to get in the slaves. But also the fact that the slaves, being Africans, they were able to handle the heat a lot better than the European population. Apparently, I don't know how true that is, because I think people adapt. But all the rest, yeah, that's generally what. That's, yeah, that's generally what happened with the uh, question of slavery for a long time in regards to the South. Like someone like Robert E. Lee, guys like him would be a lot more common than people think about how they would have freed all the slaves if it meant no more bloodshed regarding the Civil War. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is one thing I can have an intense loathing of is like the constant mobilizing about the Civil War. I mean, I can imagine the amount. It's like the same with yeah. That's the thing with because that's the thing about the slavery thing. My personal opinion, and I could be wrong, but I still believe that even without slavery, I still think the Civil War probably would have happened. It just would have happened in a much different way. Just slavery just added a moral angle to it, and God knows the average shit-lib Lewis talking about slavery. It's the only sticking. It's the only point we've got because when you talk about state rights, because that's the thing. When Jefferson Davis was arrested by the Union Army, they did not put him up for trial because they knew full well that secession was a legally murky area. And they knew that because Jefferson Davis, I believe, was a lawyer before the war, or rather, he was Secretary of War before in the past. And he was probably the best Secretary of War the Americans ever had because he tried to. One thing Jefferson Davis tried to do was he tried to introduce camels into like Arizona and New Mexico, which imagine if you had camels being a thing. I remember because that'd be very interesting if camels were a thing in North America, but sadly that wasn't to be because of a civil war breaking in when it did. The funny thing is, I know there's a village in Derbyshire called Ypres, where so basically everyone there got the plague back in 1665 or 66 when the plague hit, and the thing was with that, everyone born in Ypres from that point onward, everyone was immune to malaria, the flu, and bubonic plague, of course, for natural reasons, because the same pathogen that causes malaria is the same pathogen that causes bubonic plague. Apparently, that they share so many similarities. And yes, so that town of Ypres as well. I mean, yeah, so. Yeah, I know with the South, because this is one thing where some guy posted earlier this year about how so you notice in the South you've still got all these Confederate societies, you've got all these Confederate reenactments and all this Confederate memory kind of thing, like Confederate daughters and all the rest of it. Meanwhile, in the North, you don't have anything like that for Lincoln and Grant, because the North, which got so swamped with immigration, especially with Ellis Islanders like Aton Shea, who I think is half Croat, I think. And yeah, it's just a lot. I mean, Ellis Island immigration really just, the Ellis Islanders really misshapen the North states in terms of, for example, to a point where they don't even have like special Civil War stuff anymore, like the South does. And it's also worth noting as well that the South, it's something like a quarter of Southern men died or got maimed in the Civil War. So that's probably why the memory is so alive in the South, unlike for the North as well, for that matter. But I know like British heritage. I mean, I'm pretty sure like the vast majority of Southerners are British in terms of heritage. But that probably explains why I'm so drawn to the South the way I am. Yeah, I mean, I know there was a guy I saw posting about how Miami is basically more like Cuba than it is anything southern, because technically, I would say Florida is a southern state because it was part of the Confederacy. However, Florida, especially in Miami way, I mean, there's nothing southern about that. It's just loads of Hispanics because I think they're the only people who can live there because of the way the terrain is. I mean, I mean, I have to. I mean, you get like swamps like in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, and like in the South, where you think to yourself, it kind of speaks to the character of the settlers we sent there. But kind of speaks to the character of all Scots, especially who who ekes out a living in such difficult terrain and such difficult climates and all the rest of it. But as TR and backwards in his commentary book, the Ulster Scots, or Scots Irish, as you lot would call them, very much a vanguard of American civilization. It's like what one statistic that boggled that really astounded me was so when the Texas Revolution happened, you have 7 million Mexicans against 30,000 Anglo-American settlers in Texas, and the 30,000 Texans win against 7 million Mexicans. I mean, what more can you say about, for example, the Texans? And also, I saw some people having a debate over whether Texas is a southern state or not, and I'm sat there thinking, like, from the Civil War alone, the Texas Brigades were probably some of the bravest men that the Civ ever had to field. There's not to crap on any other southern states like Tennessee or Virginia or North Carolina, North Carolina contributed the most men, I believe, in terms of sheer numbers, but the Texas Brigades probably were some of the best men the Confederates ever had to field, especially Antietam and the Texans you get under, especially the Texans at Battle of the Wilderness, and then as I mentioned before, with Granbury's Texans at the Battle of Ringgold's Gap. Yeah, that's probably true. To be fair, Florida, I think like even in the context of the Civil War, we still had to garrison forts to deal with the Seminoles, because the Seminoles are still a massive pain in the arse in the mid 19th century because of how difficult the terrain was. It's still very much a frontier state, so I'm not surprised Tallahassee is probably the furthest state you got. Yeah, I get why, because Texas. I used to work out Texas is bigger than like Western Europe, so I can understand that, but it's also a matter of, well, it's like when you look at Texas, the genetic, like, so the guys who settled Texas, guys like Sam Houston, you've got David Crockett, James Bowie, they're all Southerners, without doubt, and it's like it's a bit funny because I understand where it comes from, because it's like I play EU4 Superstates mod, but when I play as Texas, I always create the Confederate States when I'm playing as Texas these days in that mod, and the EU4. You Robin Universalis 4, which yeah, but it's fair to say, yeah. Well, also, I think of the Tejanos from Peninsula, like the Texicans, or I've heard them called the Texicans. Basically, because technically Texas is usually part of Mexico, and there's still some. Because I saw one post where it said like this Hispanic girl who lives in Tennessee, she's got ancestors who fought for the Confederates, and that confused a lot of leftists. But when you think of it, it makes sense, because plenty of Tejanos. Yeah, I always put it Tejanos because I studied Castilian Spanish. I never studied Mexican Spanish, where they pronounce certain words differently to how they would do in Castile. Yeah, so you have Tejanos, which it makes sense when you think of it, because those Mexicans, or ethnic Mexicans who lived in Texas, they sided with Sam Houston at the Battle of San Jacinto, and why wouldn't they fight for the Confederates? Like they're fighting for their state rights and all the rest of it. It makes sense, but for some reason it breaks the mind of a leftist when you mention there are Hispanic people who fought for the Confederates back in the Civil War. It makes sense to me, but it breaks a leftist for some reason. Yeah, I know. I know one stream I'm planning on doing is with a commentary, and a big part of that commentary stream, I don't know when I'm going to do it. It'll be like probably September or October kind of time. I say October. I'm going to do a stream of a commentary around that time, and I'm going to mention the Texas Rangers. So, if, for example, someone like Alabaster wants to join me for, or you would be, or anyone else here who's got like Texan ancestry wants to join me when I do the commentary stream later on this year, I say you're welcome, because be a welcome addition. But yeah. Yeah, I know. There was also Juan Seguin, who was who fought at the Battle of San Jacinto, leading Tejano cavalry on the right flank. So yeah, yeah, yeah. So without further ado, I'll end the stream. I would just to reiterate, next week, either on the Thursday or the Friday, I will be doing a stream alongside guests on the Reconquista. So keep an eye out for that. I don't know. I know for sure I'm going to have Iron Duke, Tharium, Mercian, Beta Britannia, and strong chance there'll be. Well, there's a strong chance there'll be AR Shaitori because he knows a fair bit about the Reconquista as well. Because it was Mercian's idea, and I think it's a good stream, and it doesn't overlap with anyone else I know who does history streams. So yeah, watch out for that next week. And without further ado, I don't have any plans for June, by the way. So if someone, like, if let's say someone who I know or someone who can, if someone let's say proposes a topic for a stream in June, I'm happy to hear suggestions. Or the only thing I'd ask is give me a week's notice so that I can read up on it. That's the only rule I've got when you're talking about recommend me topics. So without, oh yeah, I saw Stan Watie, or Stan Watty, how you pronounce it, Cherokee guy who fought for Confederacy, the last actual Confederate general to surrender. He had his memorial destroyed or something. I mean, just like in Oklahoma. Just spiteful left wing crap as per usual. It's the same with what did Traveler's grave, like Traveler, Robert E. Lee's horse, and yeah. I don't know if you're if you're on Discord, I'll type my Discord handle in the chat when I get it. So I'll type my Discord handle here. Yeah, the Cherokee are very interesting people. I think everyone in Texas has blood from Cherokee because when the U.S. soldiers were I don't know whether I know like the Cherokee because the thing was a lot of U.S. Army garrisons in the area of Texas and Oklahoma they very much loved the Cherokee women, but mainly because they were the only women around. But it helped also to they were attractive. So like that's why, for example, someone like forget the name of the podcast guy now. Joe Rogan. That's why someone like Joe Rogan has Cherokee ancestry in him. As I imagine you would pick as well, for that matter, as a guy descended from Texans, because okay, that's my Discord handle. So without further ado, I mean, is this what I mean? I would say Duke knows you, Alabaster, by the way, so I could invite you to Iron Duke's Discord, where Iron Duke, myself, Peter Britannia, AI Shaitori, Aaron Hook, etc., all chill out streams. So I can invite you into that because we both know you and we both can vouch for you. So without further ado, I'll end the stream here and see you all next week.